Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku trained with Stain to become the first quirkless hero? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanf. If you had told Izuka 5 years ago that he was training to be a hero under the guidance of a villain, he would have, well, maybe not laugh, but certainly frowned and would have said that he would never do that. Yet here he was, training to be a hero with the help of a villain. While it wouldn't have made him laugh, it did now. He found it quite hilarious and so ironic. Because everyone kept telling him, that he couldn't be a hero. That it was too dangerous for him. That he was too weak, too fragile. That he needed to be realistic. Everyone, the teachers, the doctors, his classmates, Bakugo, even his mom. And the only person to ever tell him otherwise, the only person who told him, you can be a hero, was a villain. How ironic. He honestly was about to give up on that day. Nothing particularly bad had happened. Just the usual. Waking up, eating breakfast alone, since his mom was already out working a 12-hour shift. Then he went to school, walking fast and keeping his head down. As soon as he had stepped inside the school, his classmates had started bothering him again. He could take the beatings, the slurs, the insults and the false accusations. He could take it really. It's been years that he was enduring it, every day. He should have been so used to it by now. And he was. Sort of. Because at first, he thought he was just a late bloomer. That maybe in a couple months or couple years, he might develop a quirk. So he was okay at being pushed around, at enduring his childhood friend's ire. But after 3, then 4, then 5 years, he understood that there was no chance to get a quirk now. He knew the statistics well. He also knew the statistics of the length of the quirkless lifetime. So it was then that the bullying, because that's what it was starting to slowly get to him. He kept telling himself he could take it, but now that he was thinking back at it, he really wasn't okay. So anyway, he had gone to school that day. And when he had arrived at his desk, he knew it was going to be a slightly worse day than usual. Because there had been a pretty red spider lily on his desk. If he had been collecting them from the start, and if flowers never withered, then he would have been in possession of a huge bouquet of red spider lilies. Even if red was his favorite color, it used to be yellow but now it was red, this flower wasn't his favorite at all. Never had been, never will be. So he had held back a sigh and a sob, and had sat down, ignoring the snickering of his classmates. But again, it wasn't out of the ordinary. Later that day, someone had pushed him down the stairs, it had made him late to his afternoon classes, and the teacher had scolded him, even if Izuka knew he had seen the blood leaking through his pants at his knees. And of course, there had been the usual beat-up after school. Bakugo had been the one to do it, and it had left a hole in his vest, a nasty burn on his skin and his latest notebook half-burned. Stupid Deku. The usual. So he didn't know why that day was the day his 10-years-old self had thought enough. But he had felt so tired. Covered in bruises and burns and his own blood, his notebook in his hands, half destroyed, again he had walked. And walked. And walked. And he had ended up on a beach. A smelly, dirty, full of garbage beach. The Takoba Municipal Beach Park. It was the smell that had snapped him out of his dissociative state. The putrid smell of trash added to the salty air of the ocean. And when he had looked around him, aching all over, he had thought that it was the perfect place for him. Exactly where he belonged. With the garbage. With the useless, stupid trash. Like him. Because it had to be true, right? Everyone told him that. He was just useless, a burden, weak, delusional, stupid Deku. He had felt his heart contort in his chest, he had felt so much pain, not from his wounds, but from the fact that this was probably true in the end. He couldn't be a hero. He was just a nuisance, a bother for everyone, a burden for his mother. He was nothing. He deserved nothing. His life was useless. His own existence useless. Burning hot tears had fallen quietly on his freckled cheeks, as he had turned his eyes towards the ocean. And for a brief moment, all the negative thoughts, the pain and despair had flown away, as he stared at the endless body of water. The sun was being reflected on it, and it was shining, it was beautiful. He didn't know how long he had stayed there that day. Seconds, minutes, hours. It didn't matter. Because just as he was starting to walk towards the ocean, towards the oh-so-inviting eternal water in movement, ready to become one with it, to go down and never up again, to drown, a voice, someone, had stopped him. It hadn't been a friend. It hadn't been a civilian. It hadn't even been a hero. It had been a villain. Izuku blinked a couple of times, trying to come back from his memories. He was more or less trying not to think about that day, but it seemed he would always remember it, as if it was burned into his brain. So yeah, if you had told Izuku 5 years ago that he was going to be trained by a villain to become a hero, he wouldn't have believed it. Although he wasn't the worst of villains. Could have been worse. He probably wouldn't have been alive if it was that case. Izuku sighed, blinked again, and let the memory go back in the depth of his mind, like a wave goes back to its ocean. He had other matters to attend now. His eyes went up to the top of the entrance, the huge yellow letters bold and obvious, youth, and behind it, the even bigger building of the school itself. He slowly felt the nervousness climb inside of him, twisting his guts, but he was ready. He had trained for 5 years, and he knew he had the brains for the written part of the exam. What was worrying him was the practical exam. Since it was heavily biased in favor of those with strong, flashy and heroic quirk, he was going to struggle passing it. But he was ready. He had a plan. And most importantly, he was still slowly getting back to the present. He felt a presence behind him on his left. He should have noticed it earlier if he wasn't so lost in his own damn mind. Muttering again, kid? Crap. He thought he had gotten rid of his muttering habit. And he should have recognized those footsteps before panicking anyway. Izuku shrugged as he turned around, the red of a scarf in the periphery of his eye. I was kinda lost in thoughts. I figured. A moment of silence, comfortable, familiar, stretched a bit, and then, ready to pass that exam? Yeah. It was foolish of him to get that close to UA. But there weren't any cameras that were pointed at them, and Izuku was in the shadows of a tall building, facing the entrance. And so, Izuku completely turned around, and faced his mentor of now 5 years. The hero killer stared down at the quirkless teen for 2 seconds, before letting a smirk grow on his face. The teen responded with an even more feral grin. Most importantly, Stain thought he was ready. So he was going to walk in there, head high on his shoulders, and do the best he could. Izuku slowly walked towards the waves, a little blinded by how shining the reflection of the sun on the water was. There was sand going into his red sneakers, but he was past caring. And just as he was about to touch the water, I wouldn't swim in there, if I were you. Izuku was startled and turned around, his heartbeat suddenly increasing. There was a man a little behind him on his left, sitting on what looked like a downturned bin. He had long messy black hair held back by a red headband, wore a sleeveless black shirt and cargo black pants, and a red scarf wrapped around his neck and shoulders. He also had a sword, no, a katana, in his hand. Izuku blinked slowly, then went back to the man's face, holding back a little flinch after noticing he was noseless. He wasn't a hero, that was for sure, because Izuku would have recognized him on sight. Maybe a villain? His gaze went back to the blade, then to his belt. There were more knives there. Who would sit there in broad daylight with a katana? Also, if he was a villain, then why wasn't he attacking Izuku? Maybe he was so worthless that even villains couldn't be bothered to kill him. Maybe he could ask him. Dying by a blade would certainly be quicker than drowning. You want to ask me to kill you? Izuku started, again, and clapped his mouth shut. He wasn't even aware he was muttering again. It was creepy and bad and annoying, and he was always saying stupid things anyway, but he couldn't stop muttering. Hey, kid. Izuku looked up. The man was looking at him, a slightly confused and curious expression on his pale face. He had put the point of his katana in the sand, holding it by its tsuka, like it was a cane. I'm not going to kill you. I choose my victims rather meticulously. Oh, he wasn't going to kill him. But he wait, what? Izuku frowned and started to think, trying to remember, to analyze, trying to let go of the fog that had been numbing his mind for quite a while now. The red scarf, the blades, His eyes went wide. You're the hero killer? Stain. He hadn't meant to say that out loud, with a cracking voice that hadn't been used for hours and a dry mouth because of dehydration. The man's eyes, Stain's eyes, widened slightly, and he then threw his head back, letting out a short laugh. You're a smart one, aren't you? Izuku didn't say anything to that. Because it wasn't true, it couldn't be true. So they stayed in silence for a while, Stain still chuckling a little, and Izuku staring at the sand. Not that I was trying to stop you or anything, but would you mind telling me what you're doing here? Well, Izuku wasn't expecting that. Someone being interested in him? Unlikely. Unusual. And also coming from a villain? Weird. Izuku shrugged. But then, why shouldn't he talk? Who cared anyway? No one cared. No one had ever cared since he was diagnosed quirkless at age 4. So he opened his mouth and said in a raspy voice, I'm just tired. He had wanted to say more, but just saying those words aloud made his throat close up. He was tired. So tired. Exhausted even. He just couldn't do it anymore. If he couldn't be a hero, if he couldn't be anything, why would he stay? Why would he even try? A hero, you say? He was muttering again. And he just let out that he wanted to be a hero, in front of the hero killer. Maybe he would change his mind and kill him now? Still not going to kill you, kid? Stain snorted. Don't look so disappointed. Izuku looked up at the villain. He had a pensive expression on his face. Then he nodded, as if he had been arguing about something in silence in his mind and had come to a conclusion. The hero killer stood up in a fluid movement, putting his katana back into its sheath. He walked towards Izuku, and he shortly wondered if he should be worried. One of the first rules a kid learns is to be wary of strangers and not talk to them. But here he was doing the exact opposite. And it wasn't a stranger, it was a villain. But he was tired. He didn't care. Stain was almost in front of him, and Izuku had to look up so high to be able to see his face. Then the man bent one knee and the other, and promptly sat down on the sand. He was now at the same eye level as Izuku. From that close, he could see more of that man's face. His skin was so pale, almost white, the shape of his face was long, and there were a couple of silvery scars here and there. His eyes were small and completely white with tiny dark irises that were staring right into his. Tell me, why do you want to be a hero? Again, not something he expected. And it felt like a really important question to the man, who was still staring at him with interest. But he couldn't be interested in something Izuku would say, right? No one was. But that was actually a great question. Why did he want to become a hero? Normally, he would have said something like, I want to be a hero like All Might. To save people with a smile. But it wasn't accurate anymore, was it? He could never be like All Might, and his little fanboy heart broke at the thought. But he didn't have a quirk, so being like him was impossible. And saving people with a smile? He couldn't even remember the last time he smiled. So he didn't answer immediately the way he used to do. He also sat down next to the hero killer, and after a few more moments of silence, voiced his reason. I want to save people. Everyone. I want to save all the people I can, no matter what. No matter who they are. Because I think sometimes everyone needs a hero. He stopped for a moment, and turned his head to be able to see Stain's face. The villain was looking at him, eyes shining strangely. It didn't stop Izuku from adding something else. I just want to help. That's what I always wanted. To help people. He looked down at the sand again. I don't think I could be a hero like All Might, but it doesn't matter, I think. What matters is saving people, helping them. And if it's just one person, then so be it. And if it's more, that's great too. At that, he looked up again towards Stain. And he was still staring at him, eyes slightly wide and a grin decorating his face. It was a little creepy, but it wasn't menacing. You have the heart of a true hero, kid. This should be the core of what a hero is. Not what it has become now, how rotten heroes can be. At the end of his sentence, the hero killer's voice hardened and went cold. He stopped talking and took a deep breath, as if trying to calm down. Stain looked at him straight in his eyes, and added, You can be a hero. And Izuku froze. He felt tears starting to build up behind his eyes, And oh, he was going to cry because those words were all he had ever wanted to hear. 5 simple words that meant so much. But the thing is, Stain didn't know. He didn't know Izuku was quirkless. So he took a deep breath, and with a trembling voice, asked, "Even if I'm quirkless? Even if I'm just a useless burden?" Stain went still for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he had understood something. Izuku swallowed. That was it. He was going to get his dream crushed once again. He was going to be laughed at, mocked at. He was going to get told to give up, to be more realistic, that he was too weak, that it was impossible to become a hero without a quirk. The quirk doesn't make the hero, kid. It was Izuku's turn to freeze. He looked up at the hero killer, mouth open from shock. The man wasn't looking at him though, but at the ocean, and he was still talking. Quirks, even if they're strong and flashy, doesn't make you a good hero. A quirk can't be heroic. It cannot be villainous as well. Because it is what the person uses it for that matter. Heroes nowadays are so obsessed with quirks, and with popularity and ranking, that they forget what it means to be a true hero. Gets to their head their ego. Like before, his voice had hardened as he spoke, and there was so much conviction, so much passion in his words. He turned back to Izuku, a slightly unhinged expression on his face, and said, "The fact that you don't have that will keep you from corruption. Maybe not entirely, but there's a chance. And what you said? You have the heart of a hero." Izuku didn't know what to say. On one hand, he was kinda upset about hearing so many bad things about heroes, but on the other hand, no one had ever told him that. No one. Tears were now starting to slowly fall from his eyes. Maybe he could do it. Becoming the first quirkless hero. Someone finally believed in him. "Oh no. Don't cry. I don't like kids crying." Izuku sniffed. "Sorry, it's just no one ever told me that before. Are you sure?" He couldn't help but ask. His whole life, everyone told him that he couldn't. And now, someone just did, and he was a villain. "I don't like to repeat myself. And I already told you twice." It just made Izuku want to cry harder. The vice that was encircling his heart was loosening slowly, and he felt a little bit of hope coming back. But how? I don't have any super strength. Or anything useful about me. How could I dash? Everyone has a skill. Everyone has a strength or two. It doesn't have to be related to a quirk. For example, you're pretty smart. Few people would recognize me if they saw me. But you did, and almost right away. That is a skill. Well, he wasn't wrong, but everyone had told him that his knowledge about quirks, heroes and villains, and everything hero-related was weird and creepy, so... But it started to seem that what everyone told him wasn't always the truth. Another example. Stain must have noticed his hesitation, so he was still trying to convince him. "My weapons of choice are blades." At one point during their talk, the hero killer had taken out his katana, and had laid it flat on his crossed legs, one of his hands on its tsuka, the other on the blade. "But it doesn't really have anything to do with my quirk?" Izuku's eyes widened. Stain's quirk wasn't actually known, since pretty much all of his victims weren't coming out alive of their encounter. So Stain admitting this, to a random kid, was huge and dangerous for the man. It wasn't related to his blade, huh? Maybe something about his eyes, because they were almost entirely white, and often mental quirk was affecting the eyes in a certain way, or the hair. It probably wasn't a mutation quirk, or at least he couldn't actually see it. But his choice of weapon must be related to his quirk, or at least help him use it. Because it would have been easier to use a gun, and just shoot heroes with it. So the blades were doing something specific, they were cutting, so maybe something about blood? Maybe he could use it? See? Cleverness is a very useful skill to have. Izuku jumped and shut his mouth. He had been muttering again, "Oh no." He looked fearfully at the man. Maybe he was going to get killed now, he knew too much, and maybe he was annoying and creepy with his analysis and his muttering. "I'm sorry, Stainson, I won't do it again, I'm sorry." Look at me. Izuku stopped talking, looked into the whiteness of the hero killer's eyes. "First of all, your muttering isn't annoying, but your constant apologies are. Stop saying sorry, hear me?" Izuku nodded so fast and so many times that he almost saw stars. "Second, like I said, you're smart. And you have potential to be a true hero, and nowadays, the hero industry is heavily missing some. Izuku was staring at Stain, his eyes open wide, his mouth tightly shut, hands gripping his pants, sand in his shoes. Stain was looking at the kid, who was almost looking back at him with admiration, as he spoke once again. Let me train you. The air left Izuku's lungs like he'd been punched in the guts. What? Let me train you to be a true hero. And once you have become one, I will be the judge to see if you really still have your hero heart. Maybe Izuku should have really thought it through. Maybe it really wasn't smart to make a deal with a villain. But he was past that, wasn't he? So, if I become a H-hero, a good one, you'll let me be, and if I don't, I'll become one of your T-targets? Because it was obvious now who Stain was killing. It wasn't some random heroes. It was the fake ones. Stain slowly smirked and extended his hand towards Izuku. Deal? After a second of thinking, Izuku took the hero killer's hand. Deal. Passing the gates of the entrance of UA was sort of like a dream. At least to Izuku, it felt like one. It was so weird being here. And also it could be his first and last time, if he fucked up his exam. Like he thought before, he felt pretty confident about the written part. The practical, a little less. He was 90% sure that they would have to fight robots. It's what the exam was every year, for a while now, so there was no reason it wouldn't be robots this time. There weren't any more public details about the practical exam though, so that's pretty much all Izuku knew about it. Fighting robots. Not at all a very biased and unrealistic test. Izuku took a deep breath and started walking towards where all the first years were going, a sort of presentation where all was going to be explained to them. He wasn't the one to pray, mostly because his desperate past prayers had never been answered, but right now he really didn't want to be seen by Bakugo or any of his old classmates. He just wasn't in the mood. As he walked, he was observing the students around him, all of his age and looking as nervous as he felt. For a couple of years now he was capable of keeping his emotions in check. It was actually one of the first lessons he had been taught by Kaizomi. During a fight, being emotional could get you killed, so controlling your fear, your panic and your anger was a must. It took a while, mostly because he was such a crybaby, but now, with countless hours of training and meditation, he could do it well. He, of course, had his moments of weakness, but he kept those for when he was alone. But anyway, stop being distracted, he had an exam to focus on. Present Mic's speech had been intense. He had been thrilled when he had saw it was pro-hero Present Mic that was presenting and explaining because oh my god, he was really in front of him, in full costume and using his quirk, and he had this device around his neck that could direct the sound of his voice and it was so cool. It had taken a few minutes of calming his inner fanboy to then focus on what he was saying. And he had been right about his prediction. It was going to be a 10 minutes run inside a real-size imitation of a city where there were going to be robots scattered all around. Different sizes, for a different amount of points. He could do this. He could run fast, find anything that could be used as a weapon, find a good viewing point, and then he would hunt. That was his plan, at least. A student had interrupted Present Mic's explanations, and from what Izuku had seen with his dark blue hair, squared jaw and even more squared glasses, he maybe was related to the pro-hero Ingenium. They looked so much alike. He may have seen him while entering the meeting room and had caught a glimpse of some sort of leg engines. Kinda cool, but also kinda annoying with his questions. If he had just let Present Mic continue, he would have explained everything. He had then mentioned those fourth types of villains, bots that had 0-point value. An interesting detail that surely wasn't said for nothing, so he stored the information in a corner of his brain. While heading to his practical exam area, thankful that Bakugo wasn't with him because he wouldn't have had the time to make points and try to run away from him, and that sitting next to him during the presentation had been stressful enough even if Bakugo hadn't said anything. He thought back on his written exam. He had done pretty well. He had rushed through it, writing fast, and his wrist and hand had started cramping a little at the end. He was confident he had at least an 85, but he hoped for a 90. He had been so grateful for the analysis questions, he had let his inner analyst run free. Izuku stopped walking and looked up. For a brief moment his heart stopped beating, but then started again. No need to panic. He could do it. He could. He was now standing in front of the city replica, huge doors closing the entrance, and he was encircled by a lot of students. He took another deep breath, rolled his shoulders, and tried to relax his tense muscles. He couldn't allow himself to have a cramp. Focus. While waiting for all the other students to arrive, he looked around him, searching, analyzing. Maybe there would be any students with useful quirks for him to know about. He spotted a few with obvious mutations, horns, wings, and different skin color. Focus. Most of them were wearing sports clothes, or any kind of clothes that were adapted to their quirk. Izuku himself was wearing what he wore usually during his training with Kaizome: black cargo pants, comfortable boots, and a loose long-sleeved black shirt. He would have had his belts and straps to carry his blades, but unfortunately, no weapons or tools were allowed if its purpose wasn't to help support the quirk. And since he didn't have any quirk, he had hesitated to send a personal request to Principal Nedzu, but in the end he hadn't. If he was going to pass the practical, it was with what he had, and only that: skills, determination, and pure spite. He had taken his fingerless gloves though. Focus. He stopped watching the other attendants and looked up, where he knew someone, probably Present Mike, was in the tall sort of tower that was at equal distance from all the battle centers. All the students were here, no more were arriving, which meant, and start. It was soon going to start. Izuku reacted instantly, starting to run through the crowd of frozen, surprised students. What were they waiting for? To be given more instructions? All had been said, and during a real battle, there never was any countdown. He rushed through the wide open doors, straight into the city, followed by shouts of the other students. As he was headed toward a stop sign, he heard Present Mike spoke his own thoughts. What's the matter? There's no real countdown in a battle. Run, Ruin. Behind him were now the sounds of all the people running and some shouting, all dispersing in the city, trying to find the first robot to destroy. Him, on the other hand, was arriving towards that stop sign. Focus. His heart was already beating faster, but it had just started. He took the pole of the sign with both hands and pulled. It was made of metal, but it wasn't the first time he did this. He just needed a well-placed punch with his foot, and the pole bent at its bottom, and he put his whole weight on it. He used to be small and thin, feather-light, but while he had stayed small, he had put on some weight, all coming for the muscle mass he gained. He grunted, pushed a bit more, and yes, the bottom of the pole broke. Perfect. He had a metal pole. It wouldn't be enough to take down a whole robot, but it would certainly help. He took a few seconds to get used to its weight and how to move it, then nodded for himself. The whole ordeal took about a minute. 9 minutes to go. He needed to hurry up. And so, for the next 7 minutes he took down robots. He had gone for the ones worth 1 point first, to see how they worked and how to take them down the fastest way possible. Throwing the pole like a spear into their eye was a good technique. The material there was apparently less sturdy than the rest, so the pole sank into it with almost no resistance. It made them sort of glitch, slowed their movement, and so all Izuku had to do was to climb on them, which was easier than expected and very doable. There were enough grips for him to take and rise at the head of the robot, take back his spear pole and behead them. It was like strangling someone, passing his 2 arms around its neck, a weak point of its construction, because it allowed it to move its head around, so it had no hard armor, and all Izuku had to do was squeeze and pull. Most of the time he didn't need to take the whole head off, because when most of its wires were too stretched or broken, it stopped working and fell down, killed. Then he jumped down and started running towards the next robots. Between his takedowns he was helping other students. Sometimes, some of them were stuck under debris, or really struggling with a robot, and he would step in and do his best. Killing machines could be fun for a while, but helping people, that's what he wanted to do. That's why he was there. Izuku was about to go towards another robot when it was destroyed before him by a blonde boy with a sort of sparkling laser coming out of his belly. Which was pretty cool. He also had a belt. Was that a support device? Or part of his quirk? How was that laser sparkling and what was it made of? Light? Maybe it... He was pulled off of his thoughts by a loud noise. It startled him and he turned around and looked up and up and up. What the fuck is that, he thought. As the massive robot, taller than the buildings, was making its way down the road, towards them, students were running away from it. Which was totally understandable. Izuku was still observing it though, because there was something he had forgotten, a detail that was just there. Oh, that was the 0 pointer, wasn't it? Value of 0 point, just there to mess with the participants. It's destroying everything in its path, though that's pretty dangerous. I hope they have a sort of command system to stop him from moving from afar, because in the corner of his eye, he caught something. There was a girl there, stuck underneath a bunch of broken walls, and shit, it was going to crush her. Without thinking more, he rushed towards her, navigating between panicked students and debris. Don't panic. You don't have time for that. Someone needs help. Focus on that. Focus. Hey, need a hand? The girl, brown short hair and brown eyes, looked up at him with a relieved expression. She then nodded and proceeded to explain that she was only stuck and was too tired to use her quirk, which could nullify the gravity of any object. How cool was that? He was about to say something, but then he turned around to the 0 pointer. It was getting way too close, he wouldn't have the time to get her out. He gritted his teeth, took 2 seconds to make his decision. His eyes tracked down the robots, searching for anything, weaknesses, something. His eyes went on its feet. All robots, he had noticed, had a sort of control panel on them. It was inaccessible, of course, but surely this one must have one too. One that could be easily reached, since the people that built them and reconstructed them had to use it, so was he going to take the risk to run headfirst towards the huge feet of the robot, and perhaps get crushed in the process? To save someone, he would do it in a second. He turned back to the girl, said in a rushed voice, I'm going to try and stop it. Use that time to get free, try to use your quirk even if you feel you can't. Without waiting for an answer, he charged forwards. As he approached the robot, time seemed to slow. He felt as if he was hyper-aware of everything that was happening around him. He ran as fast as he ever ran, avoiding fallen debris and ones already on the ground. He felt his heart beat fast but steadily, his breath was deep and controlled, his leg and arm muscles were burning. The noise was deafening, but he clenched his teeth. He was way too close to the feet, but he just needed to see there. At the joint between the start of the leg and the up on the foot, was a sort of closed door on the metal panel. Exactly what he was searching for. A quick look back informed him he was far away from the girl, who was still stuck and apparently looking at him with wide eyes. So he focused back and jumped on the moving foot. One hand to grip on a corner in the metal, the other planted his pole into the facade. A shock went through him as the foot went down, almost making him fall. Come on. All you need to do is cut those wires, it should slow him down. He climbed higher, took out the pole, and with all his strength hit it into the panel. It went in, and sparkles of electricity went out of it. A quick thank you to his electricity-proof gloves. And then with a loud cracking noise, the whole robot slowed down and stopped moving. With a relieved sigh, Izuku let himself fall, landing on his feet. He looked up and saw how close he was to the stuck girl. That was close. As he walked back to her to help her, Present Mick's voice resonated through the city. The test is over. He ignored it and started to lift one of the broken walls that was over the girl. Here, can you move now? He asked. Oh yes I can. A bit of shuffling, a grunt and then, thanks. You can let it go now. Izuku nodded and let go of the wall, which fell heavily on the floor. He turned towards the girl, who was looking at him with slightly pink cheeks and a thankful expression on her face. He still wasn't used to being social, since his only interaction for the past 5 years had been with a villain, his bullies and an absent mother. So he didn't really know what to say and there was a few seconds of awkward silence. Oh. How did you do that? I mean that's really cool, huh? Izuku blinked, not used to any form of praise. Kaizome wasn't the one to say nice things or to praise him. When Izuku did something right, he usually was less harsh on the rest of their training session and sometimes bought him some food. Izuku shrugged. Well, every robot has some sort of panel control, and I thought that surely this one had to have one easily accessible, so he didn't end his sentence, letting the girl understand the rest. Oh, that's clever. She nodded fiercely, and Izuku almost smiled. She was nice. She also didn't know his quirkless status, so he stayed on his guard. My name is Uraraka Ochako. Nice to meet you. She bowed slightly, a big smile on her face. Midoriya Izuku. Likewise. He nodded in response. After that, she continued chatting happily, overwhelming him a little. She was nice, don't get him wrong, but she was a little too bubbly for him. Then, everyone had headed to the exit, and Pro-Hero Recovery Girl was checking on everybody to heal any injuries. Izuku himself wasn't badly hurt, a few scratches here and there, but no open wounds, no heavy blood loss, and he honestly was grateful for it. He had a pretty high pain tolerance, so it wasn't the pain that was bothering him, it was just annoying to be slowed by injuries. He only knew that tomorrow his muscles would scream of soreness, and it wasn't going to be a good excuse to miss training with Kaizome. The sadistic bastard. After changing back into normal clothes, saying goodbye to Uraraka with a promise on her side to meet back when they were both into the hero course, he left the UA campus. It had been a long, stressful day, but it wasn't the most exhaustive one he ever lived. Nothing compared with Chisome's training. As he walked to the train station, he realized he hadn't counted his points. He grimaced. Well, he surely got some villain points and some rescue points. Also, he didn't know if taking down the zero-pointer had any value, but surely the giant robot wasn't there for nothing. The exams were organized by the director himself, who had an intelligence quirk. Everything must be a calculated move. But not everyone was thinking like him. Izuku, a paranoid teenager with too much imagination and bad experiences in life, who was overthinking everything and anything. So he shook his head and concentrated on getting home. Then he would meet with Kaizome. He couldn't wait to tell his mentor about the events of today. With that, he felt lighter on his feet, and he let himself relax his tense body. He did the best he could. So, first, I'm going to teach you how to fall without hurting yourself, and how to avoid getting punched. Izuku nodded almost violently, listening avidly to his new teacher. Today was his first day of training with Stain, and he was so eager to learn. He was finally learning how to fight. Soon, his excitement lessened and turned into exhaustion. Not even 10 minutes into the lesson, he was already aching, tired, and covered in bruises. Who knew falling correctly was that complicated? Well, he knew now. But he didn't complain. He just stood up again, wiped his face from sweat, and faced Stain again. And again. And again. But he always got back up, and each time, he was sure that Stain's grin got wider, and his eyes shone brighter. That first day of training was hell. That's what he thought at least. While he got back home, the night started to fall, he wondered what he would say to his mother. While she was pretty much never there and left him alone in their apartment very often, she wasn't mean to him. She left him some money, the fridge was always full of food, and she was paying the rent. He honestly wasn't asking for more. A hug or two sometimes wouldn't hurt. And some comfort and support. But he was quirkless. Useless to the eyes of society, and to everyone. His mother never asked for that, for him to be a burden. It wasn't her fault. She was nice enough to let him stay in their apartment, so really he shouldn't wish for more. His body was aching everywhere, but a different kind of ache that he was used to by the bullying. It was nice. Izuku smiled as he remembered his parting words with Stain, a promise to meet again at the same place, the day after. The man hadn't said anything about his skill, but he hadn't said anything mean either. So Izuku thought he didn't do badly. Also, he was totally going to train on his side, researching tutos on the internet. Stain had also told him he was going to have a strict regime, and had to learn how to stretch well, and maybe try meditation. It seemed like a lot, and Stain had laughed at that, telling him it was just the beginning. Because after learning the basics, he would then learn swords fighting, hand-to-hand combat, and other skills Stain taught was useful. Izuku walked a little faster, a smile on his lips. He was going to work his hardest. Mom? I'm home. Silence answered him. Izuku sighed. He didn't know why he still expected her to answer him. She was probably working a 12-hour shift again. As he undid his shoes and put them by the door, groaning when he felt his muscles ache at the movement, he wondered if he was going to tell that he had applied to UA. He had stopped talking about his dream of becoming a hero after meeting Kaizome, so surely she was thinking he had dropped the idea and was going to apply at another high school. But that wasn't the case. What was he going to say if he got in? He sighed. He didn't have to tell her. After all, when was the last time they spoke? 2 weeks ago, when she had noticed he had a pretty big bruise on his jaw, thanks Kaizome for that one, and had asked him if he had gotten into yet another fight. Because yes, for her, he wasn't getting bullied, but he was being a distraction and starting fights with other students. He hadn't really answered, he had just shrugged. She had sighed, looking disappointed, then left the apartment for the night. Honestly, thank God she wasn't more curious, because come on, she surely would have noticed something was up with him. And he would have gotten in so much trouble if someone had discovered he was in contact with the hero killer. He shook his head, clearing his thoughts. What he wanted to do now was take a shower with hot water, get rid of all the dried sweat. He went into his room, put his stuff down on his bed, took some clean clothes, black cargo pants, black sleeveless shirt, in fact pretty similar to what he was wearing during the exam. His wardrobe had changed quite a lot after meeting Kaizome. Practical, comfortable, and unnoticeable. He went into the bathroom, lit up the room, and his reflection in the mirror looked back at him. His skin was pale, and he had some dark circles underneath his green eyes, making his freckles more noticeable. His hair, now longer than ever before because he didn't have the time nor the money to go to a hair salon, not because it looked cool on his mentor so he had wanted to do the same. He didn't know if it was because he was older or because of the length, but his hair was darker, almost black, but when it was under the light, specks of green could be seen. He pushed his hair back, noting that he should tie it up when training. What also changed since all those years were the scars. He had quite the collection now. The most noticeable were Bakugu's, looking like a handprint on his left shoulder, and another patch of burned scarred skin. The handprint one was the most recent one Bakugu left him. He sneered, remembering what had happened. He knew Bakugu wasn't a nice person now. He knew that. But hearing him say that he should jump off a roof and hope to have a quirk in his next life, that had hurt. Because now, Izuku knew he wouldn't be able to forgive him. He had been suicidal most of his life, had effectively tried to end it. If he hadn't met Stain, and would have heard Bakugu say that to him, he honestly was pretty sure he would have done it. And it had also been the day All Might had told him he couldn't be a hero. He ignored the thought. Now there were also scars he got while training with Kaizome, mostly straight lines scattered everywhere, each time blades would touch him. Because Kaizome being Kaizome, he wasn't using blunt blades for their lessons, but real ones, sharp and ready to kill. So yeah, he had ended up with a lot of scars from that, mostly in the first years of learning sword fighting though. Now he was proud to say he had equally given back some of his hits on the man. The first time that happened both of them had been so surprised, it had made Izuku laugh. And even more surprising, Kaizome had laughed too. The memory brought a small smile on his face, and immediately, his dark green forest eyes cleared and became a bright emerald green. Shower. Focus. He undressed himself, got into the tube, put the temperature the hottest he could endure, and let it run down his neck and back, eyelids fluttering shut. He stood there under the spray for a good moment, enough to make him sleepy and relaxed. After a good scrubbing with soap and shampoo for curly hair, he got out, dried himself fast, put on his clean clothes, and instead of drying his hair, he tied them in a high bun, because he was too lazy for more. Time to meet up with Kaizome. He headed out, taking his phone, his keys, and a medical black mask to cover his face. He also put on a present Mike merch sweater, which was black, with a yellow speaker in the back, the words, yet bold and yellow as well put as if it went out of the speaker. As for the mask, it was part because he was easily recognized as the poor quirkless one in the neighborhood and didn't want to be seen, and part because if he ever was caught meeting a villain, there was less of a chance because he was hiding his face. For good measure, he even put his hood on. He walked fast, making sure to be light on his feet and not make any noise. Moving soundlessly was really practical, and the habit had been taught early into his training, becoming a reflex by now. He went into the less proper part of Muzutafu, where homeless people and not exactly villain but almost people were hanging around. The day was ending, and he knew when he would come back it was going to be night. But he was prepared. Oh, he wasn't wearing any weapons on him, obviously. All the blades he was using were old ones from Kaizome, and he would keep those. But he knew hand-to-hand combat, and he was faster and agile. Skills he got not from Kaizome, but from running away from bullies. He walked through the dark alleys, head down but hyper-aware of any other presences. He knew the way by heart now. Turn left, then continue until the old kiosk, then turn right. And there, in an abandoned small proprietary, stuck between two old tall buildings, who had a very small garden, it was mostly dried grass and a half-dead tree, but still, he arrived at the barn. Or at least, that's what he'd been calling it since he discovered the place. It had nothing to do with a barn, honestly, but it was an old traditional Japanese home. The wood was dry and some of it was rotten, but the building was surprisingly still standing and pretty sturdy. He was calling it a barn, because they had needed a code name for the place, and also because of the small garden, which had reminded him of the countryside. Yes, Kaizome had mocked his choice of name, and yes, he was going to keep it regardless. Anyway, it was the location where he trained with Kaizome, and had been for 5 years now. The inside wasn't huge, but it was enough for combat, and all sorts of fighting. If they needed to run or do parkour, then they would just do it outside. He still remembered Kaizome making him parkour the old town during a storm, laughing at him when he slipped, and telling him he looked like a wet dog. Izuku walked the little path towards the entrance, slided open the wooden door, and slipped inside, closing it behind him. He took a moment to get used to the darkness, because there was no electricity, only actual torches, oil lamps and candles lighting up the place. It wasn't huge, nor fancy, but it did the job. The walls were mostly made of bamboo, the ceiling was rather low. There wasn't any furniture, only an old sofa and a small coffee table in a corner. Then his eyes met the person sitting on the sofa, their blades shimmering under the fires of the room. How did it go? Kaizome's voice echoed through the silence, and Izuku smiled. It went well. I think so. I was able to get villains points and rescue points. All we have to do now is wait. Izuku sat down on the floor. It was all covered with tatami. Kaizome didn't say anything, so he continued. I took a pole from a stop sign, and used it as a sort of spear. And then I used it to behead the robots. Oh, because it was robots, I guessed it right. Well, it's been that for years now, but you never know. Also, there was this huge robot, and its value was 0 points, but I still took it down because I thought it was going to crush a girl. She was stuck, and... Izuku kept rambling about the exam, talking about every type of quirks he noticed, how he thought that the practical was biased, and that he had met Bakugu but nothing really happened. All the while, Kaizome was listening to his pupil, a small but present proud smile on his thin lips. When he heard that the kid had saved a girl even if it wouldn't get him any points, it was just another confirmation that he chose right. Izuku was going to be a true, great hero. It lasted for a while, then Izuku did his stretching routine. They spared a little, but ended the night early, to Izuku's surprise. Kaizome smiled at him and, slowly, lifted his arm and put his hand on Izuku's head. He patted the fluffy hair once, then retracted his arm. You did good, kid. At that, Izuku's eyes widened and shone a little bit more, a huge grin appearing on his face. Thanks, Kaizome-sen. They looked at each other for a moment more, then Kaizome turned around. Go rest. We'll meet the day after tomorrow, at the usual hour. You need a good night of sleep. Izuku nodded, even if Kaizome wasn't looking at him, and with a polite bow and a quick goodbye, left the barn. As Izuku walked out, he was still feeling slightly dizzy by Kaizome's gesture. A pat on the head. By the hero killer himself. He was smiling so big right now, he couldn't believe it. Years of knowing the man, working with him almost every day, and he had never made a gentle gesture. But he just did now. Izuku kept smiling until he went home. As he went to bed, he thought that it might be the best day he ever had for a long time. Waiting for the UA letter was torture. He thought that Kaizome's sword fighting lessons were a pain? Well, this was worse. Izuku groaned, and buried his face back underneath his blanket. In one way he knew he had probably enough points to get in. In the other way, he was quirkless. And that was a problem. Even if UA High School was one of the most known and the best of hero school, discrimination was everywhere. Izuku knew that pretty damn well. Because if the number one hero could be quirked, then what about the other teachers of UA? What about the board of governors and the principal himself? They could have looked into his file, his application, seen the word quirkless, and just throw it away without another thought. He could have already been forgotten to them. He sighed, swallowed back his anxiety. He really didn't take well All Might's rejection. Left on a roof, with his dream shattered once more. If he hadn't met Kaizome before, he's sure he would have seriously contemplated jumping, following Bakuga's advice. Advice Izuku had been told that very morning. Fun times. He blinked, willing the memory of that day away. He really didn't want to think about that. It had been a few months already, and he's sure All Might had already forgotten about their encounter. Izuku shouldn't even have asked, but he had been still his favorite hero, and it would have been so nice to be told by him that he could be a hero. But no. His one and only supporter was still and probably will always be the hero killer. Not that Izuku was mad about it. Never meet your hero, heh? Izuku groaned. Focus. What he usually did when his thoughts wouldn't stop whirling inside his head, he would spar, or train, or go for a run. Kaizome was busy, surely up to some illegal stuff, so he was left alone. Even if Izuku wanted to pry into Kaizome's life more, and stop him on his killing spree, it wasn't how it worked. It being their deal. Izuku would stay out of Kaizome's business, and same for Kaizome about Izuku. He knew Kaizome was trying to protect him the best he could from his villain activities. And he was grateful for that, really. He was grateful for a lot of things the man had done for him. Life wasn't fair. Izuku knew that too, better than everyone. So he clenched his teeth, got up, and sat at his desk, ready to lose some neurons by browsing the internet and watching conspiracy theories videos on quirks. It was here. It was here. The letter. He was going to find out if he was in or not. If he got in the hero course. Izuku felt his heart sped up. His hands were gripping the paper envelope tightly. He was going to have a panic attack, wasn't he? Over a letter. Come on. Get a grip. Calm down. Focus. He swallowed, his mouth feeling dry, and he went to his room, locking the door behind him. There was no one else but him in the apartment, but it was a simple precaution and a reflex by now. He sat down at his desk, putting the letter in front of him. Deep breath. He pushed his hair out of his face. He ripped open the letter. A strange disc fell out of it. Am I on screen? And Izuku almost died of a heart attack. Why the fuck is there an hologram of All Might's face? It took some time to jump through some hoops and get done, so for not being able to contact you sooner, that's my bad. Izuku blinked. What? He just wanted to know if he got in or not. All Might was still talking, and oh great, he was going to teach at UA, just what he needed. Was the world that much against him? Well, young man, you did more than fine on the written exam, with the results of 95%. You're the best of your year on that one. Izuku let a small smile take its place on his lips. That was better than he anticipated, and yes, maybe he was a little proud of himself. It was worth the sleepless nights and hours of endless studying. But what about his practical exam? At a practical skills rating of 97 points. With 30 villains points and 27 rescue points, you would have had the score of 57 points, which would have been enough for you to pass. However, your heroic action of stopping the zero-pointer to help Ochako Uraraka had been noticed and taken into consideration, adding to your score 40 rescue points. And so your final rate is 97 points. You're first in the ranking in both the practical and written exam. Congratulations, young man. Izuku couldn't believe it. He was just gaping at the hologram, eyes wide, a look of disbelief on his face. He did it. He passed. This is your hero academia. The hologram ended, letting the silence of the room reign. Holy shit, I have more points than Bakugo. He had to tell Kaizome. I got in. Of course you did. Otherwise my training would have been for nothing. Focus. Izuku dodged another incoming hit from Kaizome, bouncing back a little. He went for a right hook punch, missed, and backed off again. I got added 40 more points for taking down that zero-pointer. 40 points. Kaizome grunted, then went for his left side, which Izuku had seen coming, so used Kaizome's movement to try and destabilize him, but Kaizome had seen that coming as well, so Izuku missed again. Really? Yeah. Oh, and since I got first it means I got more points than Bakugo. He's going to be pissed. Kid. Izuku perked up, losing his guard. Yes? I told you to focus. And with that, Kaizome made him trip, then tackled him to the ground, holding his arms against his chest and his full weight on Izuku. The impact on the ground took out all the air in Izuku's lungs, and with the man's weight on him, he couldn't really breathe, so he stared at Kaizome's face, waiting to be released. You got this. But it was only the easy part, you know that, right? I'm not going to go easy on you anymore. Training's about to get way harsher, kid. Izuku blinked. You were going easy on me? This whole time? His voice was breathless and so full of surprise it made Kaizome bark out a laugh. The hero killer got up and extended a hand to Izuku, who was catching his breath. Let's do another round. And this time, focus. Izuku took his mentor's hand, letting himself be put upright again. Yes, sir. Spring was definitely here. The sun was bright, the sky was blue, the air warm, and the birds were singing. And Izuku hated himself because he hadn't slept the whole night, excitement and nervousness buzzing in his body, and about a billion thoughts made it impossible to sleep. Doubts, social anxiety, all of that had kept him wide awake. Stupid brain. It had been hard to believe he had made it into the hero course, but here he was, at UA front gates. First day. He hated the first days of school with passion, so he hoped this one would be different. He took a deep breath and walked in. The school building was still there, as tall and imposing as before. Izuku looked up at it. This is not a dream. It took him a while to find Class 1, mostly because the inside of the school was huge, and because he kept getting distracted at every detail he noticed. Which was a lot. When he finally made it, he raised an eyebrow to the sheer height of the door. It must have been twice his height. He guessed it was to allow all types of quirks. But still, kinda weird. And it made him feel really small, which he didn't really like. As he went to open the door, he heard some commotion coming from the inside, recognizing two voices. Great. He opened the door. Don't put your legs on your desk. Don't you think that's disrespectful towards your classmates? Heh. As a matter of fact, I don't think so. Which school are you from anyway, you 2-bit extra? Izuku stilled at the door. The probably Ingenium-related student with square glasses was making wild gestures with his arm, talking to an angry Bakugu, who had indeed his feet on his desk, a mocking scold on his face. He grimaced and took in the rest of the classroom. It wasn't as big as he feared it was going to be, and almost every student was there. He noticed a girl with pink skin, a boy with 6 arms and a mask, a student with a bird head, then his eyes fell on the girl he spoke with at the exam. She seemed to have noticed him as well, so she smiled brightly and went to him, her walk slightly jumpy. Hi. Midoriya-kun, right? You made it. I'm so glad. Izuku nodded a bit. Uraraka-san, congratulations on entering as well. She smiled brightly and he couldn't help but step back a little. As he thought before, a little too bubbly for him. He couldn't stop but look at Bakugu, who was just behind her. He was staring at him, the scold still on his face, anger in his eyes. Izuku held his glare for a moment, then dismissed him. Bakugu's problem about him wasn't Izuku's problem. He got over it, mostly, now it was Bakugu's turn. He hoped UA would help him learn and understand. He then froze, feeling his hair standing all over his skin. A presence behind him. He had let his back uncovered to the still slid open door. It was a mistake, but he had also noticed pretty quickly the presence. He turned back to Uraraka. Classes will soon start, we should go to our assigned seats. She blinked and then nodded. Of course, you're right. As they headed towards their seats, great, his was just behind Bakugu's. He dared to look back. The sight made him start a little, not having expected a sort of yellow giant worm on the ground. A big yellow worm with a human face that was staring at him. He didn't know if he wanted to laugh or just run away. So he just blinked and went to sit at his desk. The worm, the man. The man got out of his sleeping bag, and Izuku frowned. A memory was there. At the back of his mind. The man stood up. He was dressed all in black, in a sort of comfortable and practical jumpsuit, an utility belt, and a weird-looking scarf. Wait, is that a capture weapon? Oh shit, this is Eraserhead. Izuku forced himself not to react. Eraserhead couldn't recognize him. He never saw him. Izuku did see him a couple of times. He went with Kaizome on patrol a few times, using that time to analyze fights and quirks. He had seen from a distance Underground's heroes, and Eraserhead was one of the most known, if not the best. Izuku hadn't really found out what exactly the hero's quirk was, but the name kinda gave it away, as seeing him fight did. He erased quirks. Which was really freaking cool. He used to think his scarf thingy was part of his quirk or a mutation, but he did his research, and while rare, this type of capture weapon existed. Izuku stayed still and kept his eyes on the pro hero. Not the time to panic or to be a fanboy. The hero was now in front of the class, all the students quiet and seated. Took you lot 5 seconds to quiet down. Life's short, kids. You're all lacking common sense. I'm your homeroom teacher, Aizawa Shoyuda. Pleasure meeting you. Izuku swallowed. Well, if he ever went on another patrol with Kaizome, he'd have to be extra careful to not run into the underground hero, because he'd be so fucked. Then, the hero searched inside his sleeping bag and took out what seemed to be gym clothes, in the colors of the school. Wear this. Immediately. And then shove off to the P.E. grounds. Then he walked out of the room without another word. Well, at least the instructions were clear. Yue's ability to be huge was also applied to the training ground. There was so much space. Izuku kept playing with the ending of his sleeves. They stopped at his elbows, so the entirety of his forearms were uncovered, and while he wasn't self-conscious about his scars, he didn't really want anyone else to see them and ask questions. He had changed in the closed toilets and not in the changing rooms exactly for these reasons. But everybody seemed awed by the place, not paying attention to him at all, which Izuku greatly appreciated. We're going to do a quirk apprehension test? Izuku's eyes snapped back on their teacher. What about the ceremony? Uraraka had asked the question with a high-pitched voice, probably a little anxious to say anything to the intimidating hero. If you want to be heroes, we don't have time for niceties. Izuku almost snorted. That was totally the kind of thing Kaizome would say. Then he grimaced, because he wasn't sure Kaizome would appreciate being compared to a hero. Or that Eraserhead would appreciate being compared to a villain. You better bury that thought. You all understand the school's reputation for freedom on campus. Well, that freedom goes for us teachers too. Izuku put his hands in his pockets. That kinda sounded like a threat. Then, Aizawa listed all the tests they were going to do: softball pitch, standing long jump, 50 meters dash, endurance running, grip strength test, sustained sideways jumps, upper body exercise and seated toe touch. Pretty normal tests, all considered. Izuku was pretty sure he could do well in the strength, the endurance, the jumps and the flexibility. But he still didn't know most of the others' quirks. They still didn't know his lack of one. Deep breath. He had been accepted into the hero course even with his quirk status. It was going to be fine. Also, Aizawa hadn't said anything, so maybe this teacher wouldn't be as bad as the one he used to have. Bakugu, come here, do an example. Bakugu sneered, then went towards Aizawa, who gave him a softball. Go inside the circle and without stepping out, throw it as far as you can. Quirk use is allowed. Bakugu grinned, stepped into the circle, threw his arm back, and with a huge explosion and the word "die" screamed, the ball went flying into the air. Izuku had almost wanted to cover his ears but hadn't because he was used to the sound of his explosions. Didn't mean he had to like the sound. After all these years, explosions made him tense and flinchy. He didn't like it. Before anything else, one must know what they're capable of. Aizawa then showed the distance the ball was thrown on a device made for that. This is a rational metric that will form the basis of Yort's hero foundation. The device showed 705, 2 meters. That was a lot. Izuku wasn't going to be able to send it that far. He gritted his teeth. He'll find a way. Oh, this sounds fun. That made Izuku start. What? Fun? This wasn't fun. Aizawa seemed to have the same opinion as him. It looks fun, you say? So you were planning to spend your 3 years having a good old time? What happened to becoming heroes? All right then. In that case, a new rule. The student who ranks last in total points will be judged hopeless and instantly expelled. That made half the students gasp, and even one said it wasn't fair. Izuku frowned. Where do they think they were? Did they even grow up in the same world as him? When has anything been fair? With that, the test started. He went through them, discovering his classmates' quirks. He already knew of Uraraka's nullification of gravity. One of the girls seemed to have a frog mutation, which was so interesting. Another girl, tall and elegant with long black hair, looked like she had a sort of creation quirk, which had so much potential. He did his own thing, a little left out, observing. He used to do that by habit, when he was little, analyzing people and their quirks. Now he did that by necessity. Know your enemy, that's what Kaizome would say. And yes, he wasn't surrounded by enemies right now. But they could become unkind towards him very fast, or rather when they'll learn about his lack of quirk. When he looked at the scores, he found he was situated in the middle, sometimes lower, sometimes higher, but still. He nodded to himself. He wasn't getting expelled. At least not today. Then came the pitch, the exercise Bakugo had demonstrated for at the start. Izuku sighed. He had some muscles, yes, but in that kind of thing quirks were useful. Not all quirks, of course, because the student who had an invisibility quirk didn't have any advantage on him in that case. Quirks are just tools. Midoriya, Izuku, your turn? Alright, time to lamely throw a ball. He took it, then went into the circle. He was about to throw it but then was struck by an idea. He stopped his movement, then turned to Aizawa. The man was observing him with a bored expression, arms crossed. You said, throwing the ball, staying in the circle? Before asking, he wanted to be sure. Aizawa raised a single eyebrow, then said in an even more bored tone, yes? Anything allowed? As long as I stay in the circle? The teacher nodded, this time with a little hesitation. Now or never. Could you then please, lend me your scarf? Izuku extended his hand. If he wasn't used to observing people, he probably would have missed the slight widening of Aizawa's eyes. He did miss the smirk that was hidden into his scarf, though. After it seemed way too many seconds, the teacher slowly undid the scarf, walked towards Izuku, who was still inside the circle, and put his scarf into his hand. Izuku knew how capture weapons worked. Made of steel wire alloy woven with carbon nanofiber, they were linked to their owner by their DNA, and so could be moved by them, and them only. That was the theory. Because most people didn't know those were even a thing, they didn't even have the idea to try and use it. But while it was indeed made to obey one master, it wasn't infallible. Izuku closed his hand around the rough textile, then bowed his head. Thank you, sensei. Instead of putting the scarf around his neck, because he didn't want to suffocate himself by error, simply held it in his left hand, and put one tip in his right hand with the ball. He put himself into position, as if he was going to throw it normally. Please work. Please, please. Otherwise I'm going to look like an idiot. If he was concentrated enough, if he willed it enough, the scarf could move. Breathe in, breathe out. His eyes were closed, and he remembered how Aizawa moved during his fights, how his gestures were when he used his capture weapon. The scarf's movements will probably be sloppy since I'm the one using it, but its first purpose is to respond to the user's command, and they added DNA afterward to make it easier. Come on. Control and will. Like any other types of weapons. He opened his eyes, threw his arm the hardest he could, and the ball went flying, and soon one ribbon of the scarf rushed after it, wrapped around it. The rest of the ribbon around Izuku's arm shorted fast, as the rest carried the ball away and up in the air. It took a while, but in the end, Izuku was left with just a few centimeters of scarf, so he let go of his concentration, and the capture weapon fell slowly on the ground, the ball continuing a while under the remaining momentum, then starting to fall as well. Izuku turned towards his teacher, holding his breath. Aizawa's gaze was fixed on the ball, which was far away on the pitch, and was taking in the view of his completely extended capture weapon. He then blinked and looked down at the device in his hand. 101.2 meters. Aizawa looked up at Izuku, who stared back at him without flinching. Then his teacher nodded, and he walked forwards to take back his capture weapon. I apologize, sensei. But how is that not cheating? Does he have the right to do that? He didn't use his quirk, and Ingenium's younger brother, because surely that was him, had to be the one to say something, as the rest of the students were just looking at him with a gaping mouth. Bakugo was trembling with rage, and Izuku quickly turned away from him. But Aizawa interrupted the student's remark. He stayed in the circle, and I said anything was allowed. He didn't cheat, He merely used what was at his disposal to take advantage of the situation, which was well thought and logical. The answer seemed to shut him up, but he still looked conflicted. Izuku let himself breathe. What he did was okay. Logical if he trusted his teacher's words. And exactly the kind of things Kaizome would say. After that, they finished the remaining tests, Izuku still aware of his classmates. A girl with earphones plug on her ears, hearing quirk. A redhead with a sort of hardening quirk of his skin. The student with the bird head had a sort of shadow attached to him, so the bird head was a mutation, but Izuku wondered what the shadow was made of, if it was sentient. He was surrounded by so many interesting quirks. The expulsion thing was a lie, by the way. Just a ruse to make sure you did your best? Outraged responses from the students, and it made Izuku relaxed a bit. While it was a stressful move, he understood. He wouldn't have taken it well if he had been expelled on the spot, though. The last student on the list was a certain Mineta Minoru, a small guy who was currently crying of relief. He had purple balls on his head. Quirks could be weird sometimes. While they went back to the changing rooms, Izuku was accosted by a few students. "Bro, that was so cool, what did you do with the teacher's scarf? How'd you do it?" It was the redhead with a hardening quirk. Izuku took a few seconds to answer. "It's a capture weapon. It responds to its user command. I just recognized it. That's so manly." Izuku nodded, accepting the compliment. If it was one. It seemed like it. "Name's Kirishima Eijiro, by the way. Midoriya Izuku, pleasure to meet you." Kirishima smiled and his teeth were pointy. Like a shark. As they entered the changing rooms, Kirishima was still talking energetically, which was starting to be a bit much for Izuku. There seemed to be a lot of lively people in this class. He stayed silent, then excused himself to go change far from praying eyes. Again, not self-conscious of his scars, just avoiding questions. Ouch. Stain put his katana down and looked at Izuku, who was holding his left wrist with his right hand. It was the second day of training with blades, and Izuku had already gotten 2 cuts the day before, and now a new one on his wrist. The pain was sharp, but not hot and burning like Kaken's explosions, which was a new kind of pain, but not a better one. Stain grunted, went towards the coffee table in the corner and retrieved a first aid kit. It had been there from the start, and was used pretty much every day. More and more when they had picked up close-hand combat and sword fighting. Izuku wasn't complaining about the wounds. There was a lesson as well. An indicator if he had failed or not. Less bruises and less blood meant he had made some progress. That's what Stain told him anyway, and Izuku had accepted it. It wasn't like he could disagree. The deal was making sure he couldn't. And Stain had said that one day Izuku would be able to be the one who hit Stain. It only motivated more Izuku. Stain came back with the kit, sat down next to Izuku, and started cleaning the wound. It wasn't large or too deep, but it was bleeding. A few minutes later, he had a bandage around his wrist. "Can you still bend your wrist? Does it hurt too much? Let's continue." And so, they both got up again, starting where they left off. Not much had happened on that first day, but it still had been exhausting. Meeting new people, the stress of socializing, of what if it was all a joke, of being in the same class as Bakugo. Like he said, stressful. But they were nice. Ida Tenya had come to him and apologized about his comment during the quirk assessment test, and Izuku finally learned his name, a little proud to have guessed right about his relation to Ingenium. Kirishima had been nice too, along Uraraka. They were bright and loud people, so Izuku didn't really know what to do, how to react. He had noticed the quieter classmates, and he knew they had noticed him as well, understanding him. If he wasn't so anxious he probably would have talked to them, but yeah. Talking wasn't his forte. He was walking towards the gates, the sun was starting to set down. He wondered if he would have time to talk to Kaizome. He also should check his hero costume and the support weapons he had asked for. He hasn't received any kind of acknowledgement about his gear, and he hoped he could have what he asked for. He would probably see that tomorrow, during the heroic class. He adjusted the weight of his bag on his shoulders, and walked faster to the train station. He wanted to go home, take a shower, maybe go for a late-night run before that, and most of all, sleep. He was tired from his mostly sleepless night before, and it was starting to catch up to him. Izuku opened the door and was surprised to be met with the light turned on in the corridor and the living room, plus the smell of food in the air. His mom was home. He still hadn't told her about Yue. He took a deep breath, closed the door behind him. He honestly had no idea how she would react. She could get angry, or she could start crying and telling him he was too fragile for it, or she could be completely uninterested. He hoped for the last one. He passed the kitchen and went straight to his room, walking fast and silently. From the corner of his eye, he saw his mom at the stove, cooking something, her back facing him. He went into his bedroom, softly closing the door behind him. He put down his bag, quickly undressing. He didn't want her to see him in the UA uniform. It was surprising that she hadn't even asked where he would go after primary school. And she hadn't caught any of the letters he received about his entrance in UA. It had taken him a good couple of weeks to understand and sent a request for a full paid scholarship. Kaizome had helped as well. How Izuku didn't know and hadn't asked, but it had been accepted, so his mother didn't know anything about it and wouldn't have to worry about the money. Fully changed into some comfortable clothes, he got out again and headed to the kitchen. "Hello, Mom." She started a little and turned around. She had a spatula in her hand and was frowning. Izuku. "Hello." That was something he guessed. He gave her a clipped smile. "I have something to tell you." His mom sighed, put down the spatula, crossed her arm, as if she was preparing to hear bad news. "I got accepted into a good high school. It was the first day of classes today." His mom blinked, then frowned and spoke under her breath. "High school already? I thought you had still 1 year to go." So she had forgotten about that. She thought he wouldn't have to go to high school for another year. It didn't seem to have startled her too much. She glanced back at him. "Was that all?" "I got into UA." Silence. His mother froze, eyes widening, mouth gaping slightly. He put his hands in his sweatshirt's pockets, keeping his face expressionless. "Pardon me?" Her voice was choked. He repeated himself, then added, "Into the hero course. Not the general course." She was still too stunned to speak. "I got a scholarship, so you don't have to worry about the money." Maybe saying that would appease her? But she was still immobile, in the middle of the kitchen, watching him as if she had never really seen him. Izuku looked down and said softly, "I'm going to become a hero, Mom. Whether you like it or not." Then he decided to leave, to give his mother some time and space to digest the news. As he left the kitchen, he heard quiet spoken words. "They'll soon realize their mistake. They'll expel you when they realize." He clenched his teeth and closed the door of his bedroom behind him. Once again, only one person believed in him. And it wasn't his mother. He should have known she would still think him too weak. He should have known she wouldn't have accepted his decision. It still hurt though. In the middle of his chest. Izuku didn't go out of his room for the rest of the evening, staying in his bed, staring at his blank walls. Maybe he could show her. When he'll be a hero, maybe then she will see. Maybe she would be proud. Maybe. Izuku closed his eyes. Izuku had almost choked when All Might had entered the classroom, loud and huge and yellow. He had forgotten about the small detail that the #1 hero was going to teach them heroics. He would have been really excited if not for that day on the rooftop. "You should be realistic." Yeah. But Izuku understood why he had said this. It still had hurt a lot. Thankfully Kaizome had found him before he had done something stupid. Also, the #1 hero didn't seem to recognize him, which Izuku was very grateful for, because it would have been rather awkward. So he had kept quiet and tried to be noticeable. He would hate being outed as quirkless because of a stupid remark by All Might. "Are you all right?" Izuku started, whipped his head to the side to meet black feathers. Tokoyami Fumikage was looking at him, his bird head tilted to the side. Izuku blinked. "Yes. I'm fine, I just got lost in thoughts." "I understand, it is sometimes complicated to oppose the endless streams of thoughts trying to drown ourselves." Izuku didn't know what to say to that, so he smiled awkwardly and focused back on his case. The case in which was his hero costume. It was heavy and big, which was a rather good sign. With a breath, he opened it, and his smile became a little sharper. The costume wasn't perfect, but it was good for the first one. Izuku had opted for simple and practical. He didn't have anything fancy or colorful, since underground was his goal. He didn't want to be noticed, he wanted to blend into the crowd, into the night. Black cargo pants, which had kinda become his thing, had been a must. It was reinforced by carbon fiber, and if it had been added, was fire and waterproof. His top was of a black sleeveless shirt with a high turtleneck. The tissue on his neck was also reinforced, as well as slice-proofed. He could still move his neck freely, but it was one of the most vulnerable places in the body, so he had wanted to protect it. High combat boots, black as well, comfortable, protecting his lower legs, and with impact-absorbing soles. He had long gloves covering most of his arms, only letting his pale shoulders uncovered. His gloves were fingerless, making it easier to manipulate weapons. He noted that it was harder and heavier on his knuckles, and realized with glee it had been enforced with metal. His punches would hurt. His chest, back, abdomen, forearms, biceps, thighs, knees and elbows were covered in a sort of armor, not made of metal but in a sort of bulletproof textile, surprisingly light and flexible. He had a utility belt and a few other pockets scattered around. He had also wanted a long cloak to cover himself entirely, but he didn't put it on, deciding it was going to bother him more than anything for the battle trials. He didn't put on his mask either, letting it hang around his neck. It could serve him as a gas mask if needed, and would cover the half bottom of his face, looking like a sort of mouth full of black metal teeth. Then his weapons. He knew he was going to have some sort of problems with them, and he had been right. Having learned for 5 years how to fight with any kind of blades and other weapons, he had favorites and some of which were specific and personal. He had wanted to talk personally to the people making his hero costume and his support gear, but he had hesitated, only stating he needed some knives and a katana. Apparently, it hadn't really gone through. They were all in a case, long and black. There was a katana, 2 hunting knives and a range of throwing knives. This was what he had asked for, and the blades were good quality. But those were the kind you could buy from anyone and anywhere. The kind of blades he used while training with Kaizome had been from the man himself, or from some kind of illegal underground market. That's why he hadn't wanted to list his specific needs. He didn't want any hero to find it suspicious. But the knives he got there were good, if basic. It felt weird in his hands, too light or too heavy, too short or too long. He wasn't used to them. He didn't like that, but he'd have to get used to them. Or go to the support and tell them exactly what he wanted. Which was probably what was going to happen. He then noticed that each of the blades had a sort of solid glove to put on during exercise, sharp blades deemed too dangerous, looking like the protections ice skaters would put on their blades. As if Bakuga's explosions weren't lethal, or as if Todoroki Shudo's quirk couldn't encast someone with ice and kill them, as if Uraraka couldn't let someone fall from high enough to break their neck at the impact. Izuku sneered, but kept the protection on. He didn't need a lethal weapon to win a fight. He put the 2 hunting knives on the underside of his arms, secured and almost hidden. He left his throwing knives in the case, deciding to not use them before testing them. He had to practice and know how they worked before starting to throw them and make mistakes. His katana was put away in its sheath, hanging close on his back. He was grateful for the few enclosed stalls that the changing room had, giving privacy for the students that wanted it. He had noticed Todoroki using it as well, which he had stored that bit of information in the back of his mind for later. Wow, you look so cool, bro. Like a ninja. The comment made Izuku smile, which Kirishima gave back, showing his pointy teeth. His costume was also cool, his uncovered chest may be a little impractical, but since his quirk was hardening, Izuku understood. All in red as well, it made something in his mind click. Is your costume inspired by the pro-hero Red Riot, by any chance? Kirishima seemed to smile even more, and he put his 2 fists together, like giving himself a fist check. Yeah, totally. He's my favorite hero, you know? Izuku nodded and smiled. His first idea of a hero costume used to be inspired by his favorite hero at the time. Not anymore. They walked together to meet All Might at Ground Beta, and Izuku observed the others' costumes, noting good and bad designs. Uraraka's heels looked impractical, and he really hoped Hagakure had a costume on, because if not it was slightly alarming. Azuitu's costume was actually good, and seemed to fit her quirk perfectly. He understood the whole night thing for Ida, but it seemed to be really heavy. He glanced at Bakugo quickly, noticing his gauntlets. I hope he's not going to use them. Soon, every student was present and in full costume. All Might then started to explain what they were going to do. Izuku was surprised that they would do a battle trial in their first class. Learning theory and about their quirks and costumes first seemed the logical thing to do, but apparently the number one hero had deemed okay to start directly with the fights. Kaizomi had also started with the fights, letting him pick up the theory by himself, but then again, training with a villain wasn't supposed to be the same as learning with heroes, or so Izuku thought. He really needed to stop comparing Kaizomi with heroes. This will be an indoor battle trial. For this test you'll be separated into villain and hero groups, for a 2-on-2 battle. The villain team will protect a false bomb and their goal is either to protect it until the end or capture the hero team. For the hero team, they either have to capture the villains or touch the false bomb to win the exercise. After the explanations, the students began asking questions, all at the same time, and Izuku noticed all. Might being slightly confused and trying to answer all the questions. He frowned when he saw cards in the hand of the hero. Did he even have a teaching license? Being a good hero didn't mean you were a good teacher. Izuku held back a sigh. Yeah, the quote, "never meet your hero," was starting to make more and more sense. Then All Might began to make the teams, and silently in his head, Izuku listed what he thought the quirk of each of his classmates was. Team A, Midoriya, Izuku and Jirokyuka, some sort of hearing enhancement. Team B, Todoroki Shudo Ice Quirk, but pretty sure there's more to it, and Shoji Mizo 6 Arms Mutation with ears, eyes and mouth. Team C, Mineta Minoru Sticky Balls and Momo Yaoyorozu Creation Quirk. Team D, Bakugo Katsuki Non and Ida Tenya Leg Engines helping with speed. Team E, Ashido Mina Acid and Aoyama Yuga Laser. Team F, Koda Koji Animal Speaker or Controller and Sato Rikido Strength Enhancement. Team G, Kaminari Denki Electricity and Uraraka Ochako Gravity Nullification. Team H, Tokoyami Fumigage Dark Shadow an entity by his side he can control and Azui Tsuyu Frog Mutation. Team I, Hagakure Turu Invisibility and Ojiro Mashireo Tail Mutation. Team J, Sirohanta Tape Quirk out of his elbows and Kirishima Ijuru Hardening Quirk. You know a lot already. Izuku glanced to his left, where he had felt someone arriving, while he was listing the quirks. He was probably muttering, and since it was Jirokyuka that was now by his side, tilted head and curious eyes watching him, he wasn't surprised she had heard him. He nodded at her. I like quirks. And knowing who and what we'll be up against is going to be useful. Yep. It surely will be. Cool to be on your team, by the way. Her tone was even, her voice a little rough but quiet. Glad to be with you as well. I hope we'll learn something. Jiru nodded, then both of them concentrated back to All Might, who was now declaring who was heroes and who was villains, as well as which team was going to fight which team. And with all his luck, of course he was up against Team D. Great. Jiru glanced at him at the obvious sarcasm in his voice, but said nothing. Oh. Hero Team A, you have 5 minutes to discuss a strategy. Remember, capture the villains, or touch the bomb. Villain Team D, you have 5 minutes as well to decide of the emplacement of your bomb and to discuss of your strategy as well. Izuku went outside of the control room they were in, stopping when they were at a good distance from the building the battle was going to take place in. Jiru was already at his side, silently waiting for him to say something. Bakugo is going to go straight at me. I'm going to meet him, and it'll give you a good distraction to look for the bomb. You can use your quirk to find where Ida is going to guard it. She nodded. Is that plan all right with you? No one was listening to him and his muttering and weird plans, so he wanted to make sure she was all right with it, or if she had anything she wanted to add. Why would Bakugo go to you? Izuku grimaced. We know each other, and he's not fond of me really. He'll want to destroy me for sure. He's been wanting to do that for a while. Jiru blinked and then frowned. That's not very nice. Izuku almost snorted. Bakugo was many things, but no, he wasn't nice. I'll be fine. I know his quirk best and how he fights. I should be able to leave you enough time to touch the bomb. Also, I think you know, but Ida's quirk permits him to go really fast, so try to understand and anticipate his movements. If you can destabilize him, even better. Avoid him and go for the bomb. Jiraiya was listening to him and nodding along. It was weird being heard and not ridiculed for it. Can I ask? What's your quirk? I don't think I've seen you use it. And the 5 minutes are up. Villains and heroes, are you ready? The trials are on. Both of them jumped at the sheer loudness of All Might's voice in their ear, glancing at each other, sharing their annoyance. Izuku was relieved by the timing. He still had some time before making his quirkless reveal. The two heroes in training approached the building quickly and silently. Before entering, Jer crouched down and stabbed her earjacks in the wall, both of them staying quiet for a while. A few seconds later, Jiraiya got up. I'm pretty sure the bomb is on the 3rd floor. I could hear Ida's engines, she whispered to Izuku. He nodded, but as he was going to enter, she added, and Bakugo is going down, he's about to arrive at the door at any moment. Izuku paused for a second and then said, I'm going in and I'll lead him away from the stairs, then you go up. All right with you? Sounds like a plan. They nodded at each other. Izuku entered. There was a corridor in front of him, a door at his left, and he was pretty sure the stairs were at the end of the corridor, on its right. He just had to wait. DKU. He rolled his shoulders. All right. Not the time to panic. He could do this. He had trained for 5 years, could fight against a villain, and had taken down a giant robot. He could do it. He took a shaky breath. Bakugo appeared at the end of the corridor, a sneer on his face, anger in his eyes, and sparks going out of his hands. Izuku met his red eyes. Over was the masquerade he'd been playing those last 5 years. He wasn't weak anymore, he could fight back. Bakugo let out a roar of rage and charged him. Izuku waited a second, then darted to the left, through the door, entering the room. He quickly looked around, but the room was rather bare, so he placed himself in the middle, putting himself in his fighting stance. Bakugo arrived at the door, gripping its side with a smoking fist. Don't you dare run away from me, you shitty Deku. Fight me, you coward. Oh, but I plan to. Bakugo. The calm tone and hearing his name made Bakugo flinch. Behind him, Izuku saw Jiraiya sprint past them and into the corridor, going for the staircase. He wished his teammate some good luck. In his head, the refocused on Bakugo. Focus. Well, I don't have all day. Heh. Bakugo ran at him, an explosion projecting him towards Izuku, then he lifted his leg. Always the right hook, so predictable. Izuku went down, letting the leg pass above him, then, as Bakugo lost his balance, surprised by the feint, Izuku threw his arm at him, his fist hitting Bakugo on the sternum, cutting his breath. The blonde took a few steps back, trying to catch his breath, and Izuku took this time to flee out of the room. Get back here, did you? Izuku slowed down and looked behind him, and saw Bakugo charge after him. That's all he wanted to be followed and distract him, to give enough time to Jiraiya to fight Ida and touch the bomb. And so, for a rather long time, they played mouse and cat, Izuku always slipping away from Bakugo's grip, avoiding his explosions. Not once did he draw out his knives. Then Bakugo started to get really irritated, and started to explode walls, making the whole building shake, removing hiding places for Izuku. So, surrounded by debris, smoke, and out-of-breath Bakugo facing him, Izuku finally stops running around. Green eyes met red ones. Izuku charged him, running straight towards him, surprising the blonde. Having overused his quirk, only smoke was getting out of his hands and it looked like his arms hurt to move. Izuku hit him under the jaw, then on the chest, full body weight hitting Bakugo. He tackled him to the ground, practically sitting on him, both hands around Bakugo's arms, pinning him to the ground. Bakugo grunted, then stared at Izuku with so much rage and surprise, it made Izuku want to laugh, suddenly reminded of his last spar session with Kaizome. It also reminded him of the words so often repeated by his mentor. The fight is one movement, a fight lasts 1 second. Focus, find the weakness, hit fast. Bakugo screamed and tried to get out, but Izuku was heavy now, and with all his weapons and his armor, it added a couple of kilos to his weight. His grip was also made of iron, as even if Bakugo let off explosions after explosions, smaller and weaker than before, the loud noise making Izuku's ears hurt, and the smoke making it harder to breathe, his arms were still pinned to the ground. Let me go, you stupid fuck. Ah, Kaken. I don't want to be a coward now, do I? Izuku didn't know if his teasing was a good idea. No, he did know, and it wasn't, but it was nice to finally fight back. But he also knew he couldn't hold Bakugo down forever, as he didn't know how long it would take Jiraiya to touch the bomb. He had the capture tape on his belt, but both of his hands were currently occupied. Maybe if he reached his hunting knives, he would be able to pin Bakugo's arm to the floor. But his arms were bare, except for the gauntlets, and he wasn't going to stab Bakugo through the arm. Izuku clenched his teeth, ignoring the explosions, Bakugo's constant stream of insults and the aches of his own muscles. Come on, Jiraiya. I won't be able to hold it anymore. As if on cue, All Might's voice echoed, and Jiraiya touched the bomb. End of the fight. Hero team wins. Thankfully, Izuku let go of Bakugo, jumping back until he was a few meters away from the fuming teen. Bakugo got up, then looked at him. Izuku didn't think he ever saw the other that angry. I'm not done with you, Deku. What the fuck was that? Izuku was observing him, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. Even if Bakugo was the one to follow the rules, he seems to forget that behavior when he was in the same room as Izuku, so he wasn't going to put past him that he was going to attack him, even if the exercise had ended. Beginner's luck? Heh? Izuku clenched his jaw, then with a slow movement reached behind his shoulder for his katana. His hand wrapped around the tsuka and he pulled, the blade coming out of its sheath. He maintained eye contact with Bakugo the whole time, and when the blonde noticed the blade, he paled slightly. Izuku wouldn't know that in this moment, he didn't really look like himself anymore, but resemble more a certain hero killer. Young Bakugo, young Midoriya, please get out of the building. The exercise is over. All Might's voice made them both start, stopping what could have been a very damaging fight. Bakugo snarled, and looked at Izuku again. But Izuku kept his position, blade half out, waiting. The tension was so high that he could almost feel it physically. But, surprisingly, Bakugo turned around, stomping out of the room angrily. Izuku felt himself relax immediately. I thought for sure he was going to blast me through the wall. What's left of it? With a sigh, he put away his katana back in its sheath and he got out as well, rejoining Jiraiya. You didn't even use your blades, did you? Izuku and Jiraiya were at the back of the control room, observing the screens as the next battle trials were ongoing. They had sat in silence at first, then Jiraiya had asked her question. No, I didn't. Like I said, I know Bakugo's fighting style. Also, I knew how to destabilize him enough to take control of the fight. I won't be able to do the same technique against him anymore. He had also been a little scared to use them, not knowing how he would react facing his high school bully with a blade in his hand, now with the experience and the knowledge backing him up. It would have been really easy to slip into the mindset he got into when he sparred with Kaizomi. But he didn't say that out loud. Jiraiya was looking at him, easily hearing Izuku's soft-spoken explanation. They stayed in silence for a while longer, then Izuku broke it. How did you touch the bomb? I took your advice. Ida was close to the bomb, guarding it, so I started going in circle around him, going in different direction, and at one point I kept going unpredictably left and right, so it made him lose his balance. I used a sound wave to make him completely lose it, then went for the bomb. If I didn't already have endurance, I wouldn't have been able to do it. It was tiring. Well, you did great. Thanks. You too. Glad Bakugo didn't kill you. Izuku snorted. Yeah, me too. The two quiet teens stopped talking, falling into a comfortable silence. Izuku kinda wanted to pay more attention to the fights and to the other quirks, but his mind wouldn't let him. He was still tense after his encounter with his childhood friend. Old memories and old aching burns way too close to the surface. So the quiet moment he was sharing with Jiraiya was perfectly fine for him. And she seemed to understand, staying not too far but not too close of him, silent as well. Maybe he just gained a new friend? Get up. Izuku stayed down on his back, staring at the bamboo ceiling. He couldn't move. Stain had won their little fight as usual, but today had been a bad day at school. He had a burn on his back, and when Stain had hit him and made him fall, his back had hit the floor, making him see stars. His breath had caught for a moment, and he honestly thought he was about to faint. I didn't hit you that badly, come on. If you need a break, Say so? Izuku couldn't talk, could only try to breathe. He heard footsteps, then Stain's face appeared above him. You there? There was annoyance in the man's tone and it made Izuku want to cry. He just had to move to get up. He could do it. He wouldn't be a burden or a disappointment. Not to Stain. Why couldn't he move? Kid. He couldn't breathe either. I'm going to help you stand up. Rough hands took him by the arms, then he felt himself being lifted. When the kid had walked in, Kaizome had immediately felt that something was off. He always seemed so eager to train, even if he ended with bruises all the time, but today his smile was off, dulled. His normally bright green eyes looked dark. But the kid hadn't said anything, and it wasn't Kaizome's job to say anything either. But when the kid had led there, still, not breathing, way too pale and staring at the ceiling, he got worried. He was still unresponsive by the time Kaizome had picked him up, had sat him on the sofa. And when the kid's back touched the sofa and he whimpered, Kaizome froze. The kid was hurt, and it wasn't a wound from Kaizome's. He knew exactly where he hit, what damage he did, and that wasn't him. If he ever hit the kid in training, he didn't want him to be in so much pain he couldn't move. That was counterproductive. So he put the kid on his stomach, all the while telling him what he was doing, and he let himself be moved, limp, and let Kaizome take off his shirt. Kaizome wasn't expecting the fresh burn that was covering half of the kid's back. Did he get attacked by a villain while coming here? He was once again glad he was always over-prepared. He had some ointment made for burns in his aid kit. The burn was large, but the kid's back was small, so he should have enough of it. He would have to clean it first, and the barn, that's how the kid named the place, hadn't any electricity nor current water, but they had a big sort of basin in the back which stored rainwater. It would do. It took a while, but Kaizome succeeded at cleaning the wound, putting some ointment and bandaging it the best he could. He wasn't any nurse, but he had his fair amount of practice in taking care of wounds. He let the kid rest, who was still sort of awake, half aware of what was going on. Who did that to you, kid? Kaizome wasn't expecting any answers, but he heard a muffled response. My F a friend. Kaizome paused. Your friend gave you a second-degree burn? It's JJ just a game. Kaizome blinked. He knew the kid was being bullied because of his quirkless status. But that another kid that Izuku thought was his friend hurt him that much? That was, unfortunately, not surprising. He had countless reasons for why he became a villain because of others, and this was one of them. Kid, a friend that hurts you is not a friend. Thought you were smart enough to know that? The kid didn't answer coherently, only letting out a stream of murmurs. Kaizome sighed. Try to rest. When Izuku woke up, he realized a couple things. First, he wasn't home, because the texture under his cheek wasn't his mattress, but the rough feeling of a familiar sofa. Second, his back hurt, but the pain was rather dull. He groaned. He barely remembered what happened. He went to train with Stain, as usual after school, and then in the middle of sparring he had fainted? Because of the pain? He tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry. He blinked, moved his arms from his side to under his chest and the sofa, and slowly he pushed himself upward. His back stinged, but it was less worse than he expected. Once he was sitting on the sofa, he recognized he was at the barn. He was also shirtless, and there had been a blanket around him that was now pooled around his waist. You're awake. Great. Now I can finally stop watching over you. I'm not a babysitter. Izuku jumped and only now noticed the presence of the hero killer, sitting in a corner on the tatami, sharpening his katana. What happened? Izuku croaked out. You had a nasty burn on your back. Took care of it. It's 6 in the morning, by the way. He had been burned by Kaken in the changing rooms after sports class. It hadn't been nice. It was the worst one he ever got, he thought. He let his head hang, watching his hands. He then vaguely remembered the conversation he had with Stain before he had passed out. A friend that hurts you is not a friend. He felt hot tears build up behind his eyes. Why was Kaken so mean to him? Izuku didn't understand what he had done for him to react that way. Why did he hate him so much? I'm going to buy something to eat, then you'll have to go to school. Stain stood up, let his katana on the ground, and as he was about to go out he added, Don't move and watch over my blades. Izuku nodded, and then was left alone. He let himself cry, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. He knew life wasn't fair. Why did it still hurt so much? Quiet cries became sobbing, but then he didn't really have any strength left to cry, and doing so was hurting his back. After a while, when he had calmed down already, Stain came back with breakfast. They ate in silence, then Izuku put on his shirt and vest again, grimacing slightly. He was about to thank Stain and go out of the barn when he interrupted him. New rule: before training, you tell me if you're hurt. Then it's up to me to decide if yes or no you're in good enough shape to spar. Got it? Izuku nodded. Yes, Stain-san. Thanks SS for the food. And the medicine. And Dash. Stop thanking me. Go to school. Alright. Kaizome? The barn was empty. It wasn't an unusual occurrence, but it still left Izuku uneasy. Because either Kaizome was causing trouble, or he was in trouble. Izuku put down his bag, got out of his vest and his tie to throw it all on the sofa. It was already old 5 years ago, but it was even more so now. By some miracle it hadn't been eaten by any rats, so it was mainly intact. It had just way more dry bloodstains on it than at the start. Izuku went to the left side wall and slid open the sorta hidden door. Behind it was all sorts of stuff that could be used for training, and there was also the blades he used while sword fighting against Kaizome. He took the heavy punching bag, carrying it on his shoulder. Then when he was in the middle of the room, he hung it on the metal crochet that was nailed on one of the wood beams that was crossing the ceiling. It was an ongoing bet between him and Kaizome of when the beam was going to break under the weight of the bag. After doing so, he closed the sliding door, then began to roll his fingers and hand into some bandage, to protect his hands a minimum. Then he started to hit, letting out all his tension, his anxiety, and if he was imagining Bakuga's face on the bag, well, only him would know about that. Who made you angry? Izuku was startled out of his thoughts, stopping his constant throwing movements, straightening his posture and turning towards Kaizome. He was in full villain costume, no obvious wounds and no bloodstains anywhere. He probably only went on a recognition patrol. Bakugu! Kaizome raised an eyebrow as he entered the barn, slowly disarming himself. Still surprised he got in. From what you told me, that's the kind of fake heroes I'm hunting. Izuku shook his head. And he's just a kid, and he's never been taught that what he did was wrong. He'll learn. You'll see. If you say so. Don't come after me if I choose him as a target if he graduates. Izuku rolled his eyes, but didn't say anything. Their deal didn't mention anything about what was going to happen after Izuku went through the 3 years of hero school. They hadn't talked about it yet, obviously avoiding the subject. What did he do now? Kinda thought that those teachers would keep him in place. Kaizome had put all of his blades on the coffee table, now shedding the clothing bands around his arms. It was during an exercise. We had to go against each other, that's all. Kaizome paused. Did he burn you? No. I won the fight. The hero killer turned his head towards Izuku, meeting his eyes. I see that my training did a few good things. Izuku smiled softly. Yes, it did. Then he grimaced, remembering his talk with his mom the other night, and how he hadn't told Kaizome about it. What else? And of course he noticed. Izuku frowned and turned back to the punching bag, hitting it with no real purpose but to just occupy his hands. I told my mother about you, eh? A little silence. Izuku continued. She didn't yell at me at least. She still doesn't think I can do it. So, nothing new. Kaizome wasn't the one to offer words or gestures of comfort. Izuku knew that as well, and wasn't expecting any from the man. Wanna go on that beach and let it out? But that, if anything, was the kind of comfort Kaizome offered. It was something they started doing when Izuku came back from school or home angry, frustrated and just done with how he was treated, with how stupid and judgmental and mean the others could be. He was just too tense and locked in his head to be able to learn anything from Kaizome, so the man had took him to the beach they met, given him a metal pole, and his only instructions had been, let off some steam, and when your head is clear again, we'll spar. And it had helped so much. At first, he wasn't doing much damage because he had no strength, but nowadays he could easily destroy any kind of garbage that was there. Also, during his free time, Izuku took the habit to clean the beach, and after 5 years of randomly doing so, almost 2/3 of the beach was mostly clean, All that was left had been trash too heavy and too big to move. It was now used as a punching bag for Izuku. So when Kaizome asked him that, Yuzuku smiled and accepted the offer gratefully. Can't believe you wanted to drown. Shut up. I was kinda depressed. Was? You know what, I'm ready to spar. Kaizome barked out a laugh. Of course the media had to disturb the rather calm morning Izuku was enjoying. Passing the gates of UA through the crowd had almost given him a panic attack, because too much touching, too much noise. But years of training and trying to remain calm had helped him, so he had calmed down quite fast. Aizawa-sensei had also had enough and had ordered the journalists to back off. One of them finally made the mistake to walk too close to the doors, activating the automatic door closing to an unknown person. What a bunch of idiots. So Izuku had been a little annoyed before classes started, but he pushed that feeling back to concentrate on school. When he had entered the classroom, he had been greeted by a joyful Uraraka and Kirishima, ignored completely by Bakugo, then acknowledged with a subtle nod of the head by Jairu, which he gave back. The chaos of the class was interrupted by Aizawa going in. He then started to throw comments here and there about their performance on the battle trials. He didn't say anything about Izuku, but did ask Bakugo to stop acting like a 7-year-old, which made him almost snort. Then, we need to pick a class president. The class exploded in noise, almost every student shouting that they wanted to be the class president, already listing the whys in the house. Izuku tensed, gritting his teeth. Silence. I don't care how you choose, just do it before the end of the homeroom. Aizawa then slid into his yellow sleeping bag, lying down behind his deck, promptly falling asleep. There was a moment of silence, then his classmates started talking again, this time quieter. Izuku didn't want to be class president, or anything close to it. He didn't want any more attention than he already received. He glanced back, seeing Jairu at her desk, her hands on her ears, a small grimace on her lips. Well, at least he wasn't the only one uncomfortable. In the end, they settled on a voting system, and Yorizu Momo ended class president, Ida taking the vice president place. Izuku sighed, just glad that the class had calmed down. When it was lunchtime, Izuku quietly slid out of the class, wanting some peace and quiet. After having taken his food from the pro-hero lunch rush, he went outside, in the sort of forest park that was surrounding the school. He sat in the shadow of a tree, against the trunk, finally enjoying some silence. He was still not used to the loudness of certain classmates. He finished eating, putting his chopsticks down, closed his eyes and tried to go into a sort of meditative state, still aware of his surroundings but sort of resting. After a couple minutes he heard hesitant footsteps coming towards him. He opened his eyes. Jairu was standing a few meters away from him, lunch in hand, looking at him but clearly not knowing if it was okay to get close and disturb him. Izuku met her gaze, nodded and smiled, gesturing to her to come over. The look of relief on her face was noticeable even through the distance. She sat next to him, the first thing she said being, "I was looking for some quiet. The cafeteria is too loud." "Same here." They sat in silence for a while, Jairu finishing her rice, Izuku lost in thoughts. "What's your quirk?" Izuku froze. "I'm quirkless." Silence. Damn. Didn't you take down that 0-pointer? That's. Then Jairu continued eating. Izuku couldn't quite believe it. Was that it? No mockery, no disgust, no withdrawing. Acknowledgement and moving on? Like it was just a random fact about him? Like it wasn't defining his worth? Calm down, Greenie, I don't care about that. My quirk isn't super flashy and heroic, you know. The quirk doesn't make the hero. And a lack of quirk clearly doesn't mean you're weak. Izuku glanced at her, and she was looking at him, dark eyes and uneven purple bangs. She tilted her head, a small smile, a smirk on her lips. "Thanks." His voice was even, quiet, even if he didn't feel that at all. "Welcome. Did you just call me Greenie?" "Yup." "Okay." Both were startled by the sound of an alarm, far away. Izuku was on his feet in a second, hands clenching on empty air, but would have closed around the handle of some knives if he had some. Jairu got up as well. "Wait." She tilted her head, like an animal listening to noises, her ear jacks moving in the air. "It's a false alarm." The media or something? Izuku frowned. That wasn't. Something was wrong. The media wouldn't enter that easily into the campus. They have been under close watch since that morning. Izuku, out of habit, started to look around him. Gyre. Down. Immediately, both of them flattened on the ground, Izuku with a hand on Gyre's back, having taken her down with him, her reaction time too slow for him. Almost at the other side of the campus, there was a figure walking through the UA barrier, arms straight in front of him, palm facing the now non-existent wall. Izuku squinted his eyes, trying to understand exactly what he was seeing. Next to him, Gyru murmured a curse. Can you hear something? I don't. He's talking about how easy it is to enter the campus? Izuku raised an eyebrow. That was rather quacky of him. They stayed still, watching the man. Soon he disappeared inside the building. They stayed a couple seconds more on the ground, then Izuku got up, helping Gyru on her feet. We have to tell a teacher. Izuku hesitated, his eyes on the hole in the wall. He turned to Gyru, who was observing him. Can you go search for Aizawa? I want to look at the opening. He saw her hesitate, so he added, I don't think the intruder's stupid enough to get out from where he got in. I'll be careful. Gyru accepted his explanation. All right, see you. Then she darted away towards the school, going for the teacher lounge. Izuku turned around, walking at a fast pace to the wall. As he approached, a smell of ashes? Decay? Attacked his nose and he started to breathe with his mouth. He slowly came to a stop. The wall was still disintegrating, slowly becoming dust, falling into the ground. A disintegration quirk. Those were quite powerful. He knelt down, taking a little bit of dust in his hand. It was soft and the particles were so small and soft, grayish. He looked back at the wall. It had stopped decaying completely. He stood up and looked around, letting the dust in his hand go freely, floating slowly in the air. Midoriya. Izuku blinked and turned towards the voice shouting his name. Aizawa was walking fast towards him, eyebrows frowned. Gyru wasn't with him, but he supposed she went back to class. Before Aizawa could say anything, Izuku spoke. A young man, with pale blue hair, most likely a sort of disintegrating quirk, probably activated by touch. His teacher blinked, then looked at the wall, back at Izuku, then sighed. You did well to call for a teacher, although I would have appreciated it if you had gone with Gyru. Go back to class, problem child. Izuku didn't move. He's already out, isn't he? Aizawa was looking at him straight in the eyes, but it wasn't the most menacing glare Izuku ever endured. Yes. There's no more intruder in the school. Izuku nodded. As he walked back to class, he wondered who that guy might be, and what he wanted. He could have probably destroyed a good part of the buildings if he wanted, if hurting heroes had been his goal. But it hadn't been. He had wanted to get in. He had needed something from the school, and had most likely obtained it, then had got out, unarmed. He would have been totally undetected if not for Izuku and Gyru. Izuku put his hands in his pockets. He'd have to ask Kaizome. The rest of the day went calmly, and Izuku let himself relax, putting the events of lunchtime away in his head, to think about later. Izuku walked away from the school, already thinking about his sparring session with Kaizome, but also knowing the guy was busy lately, maybe he'll go straight home. Hoping his mom wasn't there. Hey Greenie. Izuku slowed, turning his head, watching Gyru walking towards him. Going to the train station? Izuku nodded. You two, I suppose? Yeah. Walk together. They didn't talk about what happened during lunch. Izuku was alright with it. At some point Gyru was humming the melody of a random song, and Izuku let himself listen to it. It was nice, walking with a friend. They went their separate way, each having to take a different train. Izuku went home, telling himself he would ask Kaizome about the guy with the disintegrating quirk the day after, or even during the weekend, maybe. But I want T to go W with you. And I'm telling you no. Too dangerous. B, but I know how to fight. You could maybe win a fight on school grounds. This is different, kid. Izuku frowned. Stain was going on a sort of patrol, and Izuku wanted to go with him. He was fast now, good to follow Stain pretty close during parkour, and could at least last 2 minutes in a fight against him. He could handle patrol. In a year or two, maybe. But I'm not putting you in an eventual real street fight between villains, you won't stand a chance. Izuku looked up at Stain with pleading eyes. The man sighed, bringing his hand to his face. I'll be as small. And fast. And discreet. You know I can be. I'll stay out of tea trouble. I promise. After another few seconds of glaring into each other's eyes, Stain groaned, and Izuku smiled, knowing he won. Alright. You do what I say or you won't go on patrol with me for another year, understand? Izuku nodded, and went to grab his gear, which was for now only 2 daggers and 2 throwing knives. He was wearing comfortable but sturdy black clothes, and wearing a black mask that was hiding the bottom of his face. Stain was in his usual villain costume. The man was still grumbling under his breath, but Izuku knew he wasn't actually angry with the situation. So they set off, first moving on the empty and dark streets, then apparently Stain decided to go on the upper ground, and started climbing the side of a building, quickly followed by Izuku. Moving and jumping from roof to roof was easier in this part of the town, since the streets weren't wide. And so, for a good hour Izuku followed Stain around, sometimes stopping to quickly check what was going on down there. Izuku liked doing that. It changed from sparring and he could let his mind wander a little, even if he was still concentrating to not fall, to stay unnoticed, and to not lose Stain from view. Stain slowed down at one point, perching himself on the edge of a flat roof. Izuku joined him, sitting beside him. The man in blue. Down from them, in a dirty and dark alley, was a group of 3 people. One of them was indeed wearing a bright blue suit, contrasting vividly with the colors and ambience of the place. The other 2 were smaller and wearing dark clothes, almost blending into the shadow of the buildings. What about him? He's been selling drugs for a while. Do you want to stop him? Stain shifted a little, putting his hand on the tsuka of his katana. Not my job. Izuku kept watching the man in blue, seeing him give the 2 others a sort of package. Then he was given some money, and the 3 parted, each going in different ways, the blue man going even further into the alley. We could stop him. Call the police and leave before they arrive. Like I said, not my job. Izuku frowned and turned towards Stain who was watching him, an amused glint in his eyes. Why did WS stop then? Stain shrugged. Wanted to rest my legs. Well, that was some bullshit, because he never did breaks when patrolling, only resting when he was back at the barn. Stain didn't do a thing without it having any precise purpose. Izuku blinked, then glared at the hero killer. Damn him. Without another word, Izuku took off, running, then jumping across the roof that was on their left. Slowing down a little, he stole a glance down the street, quickly trying to find the man in blue, and thanks to his ridiculous suit, it wasn't complicated. Izuku went down a fire escape, careful to stay silent, and arrived down on the street. He walked flat on the wall, then peeked around the corner, and there he was, the man in the blue suit. He had stopped moving, currently lighting a cigarette. Why did Stain choose this guy? It seemed too easy. So it meant that it wasn't. What was the guy's quirk? Izuku stayed still, observing the man, catching his breath silently. Stain wanted to teach him something, and, like usual, it was Izuku's job to understand the lesson. He took one of his daggers in his right hand, still waiting, watching the blue man like a hawk. Now that he really was watching, it wasn't only the suit that was blue, but everything about him, except his skin, which was rather pale. Even his cigarette was blue. A color-changing quirk? Not really harmful, but maybe it's a second effect of the actual quirk. Blue Man was now on his phone texting something, then threw his half-smoked cigarette on the ground, put his phone, blue as well, back in his pocket. He started walking towards where Izuku was. Well, now or never. He got out, charging towards Blue Man, dagger in hand. Kaizome hadn't thought the kid would actually go for it. Sure, the kid was restless and reckless, but he was almost sure he wouldn't. But then again he proved him wrong, glaring at him and then jumping roofs, quickly catching up to the drug dealer. Kaizome sighed, following Izuku. But he was also curious in how he would deal with the situation. The dealer wasn't dangerous, only having a color-changing quirk, which he thought the kid would identify with no problem. But he was still a villain, the heroes trying to catch him for a good 4 months now. He still wanted to see how the kid would fight someone else than him. The guy's villain name was Blue Stains, which wasn't original at all. Izuku was starting to get good at hand-to-hand combat and starting to get the hang of sword fighting, but after 2 years of everyday sparring lessons, the kid was starting to know him and his moves. He'd soon needed other sparring partners to really advance, but Kaizome knew he couldn't really give him that. If the kid went to UA, that's where he'll get different teachers and fighting exercises. In the end, Kaizome was only teaching him the basics. He glanced down, seeing the man in blue smoking a cig, and the kid was just around the corner, watching him. He was doing good, not just charging stupidly headfirst. Well, he's taking that back. But he guessed Izuku was counting on the element of surprise. After all, it wasn't every day that a small feral child was coming at you with a dagger. Kaizome himself wasn't used to it even after 2 years. He watched the blue man dodge, and then Izuku stayed close, endlessly kicking and stabbing. Izuku was missing a couple of hits, and his daggers wouldn't actually do real damage since the blades were pretty dull, but still, the blue man kept taking hits, screaming at the kid to just fuck off. It was a quite funny scene to watch, and Kaizome was ready to sit comfortably to observe, until the man took out a gun out of the inside of his suit. Kaizome froze. Izuku backed off, sprinting behind a huge trash bin. Kaizome jumped down. Izuku was certain of 2 things. First, he was probably going to die. Second, he was going to hear a gunshot for the first time. None of those things happened. He heard a heavy sound, a shout, a crunching sound, and silence. Izuku stood up again and got out of his hiding place. Stain was above Blue Man, who was laying on the ground, looking very much unconscious, his gun laying away from him. "You okay, kid?" Izuku blinked at Stain, then back at the Blue Man. He nodded, his lips pressed tightly against each other. Stain signed, then moved to search the man, finding his phone. He gave it to Izuku. "Call the cops, then join me on the roof." Izuku did so, not saying his own name, only naming the location and describing the victim, then threw the phone back at the Blue Man. He then walked back to the fire escape, climbed it up, finding Stain sitting in the middle of the roof. Izuku sat down, or crumbled down, next to him. "I didn't know he had a gun, and if I had known, I wouldn't have let you go after him." Izuku opened his mouth, ready to argue, but with one glare of the man, he closed it. Learn something from that, alright? Never go unprepared. Always know your enemy. Be prepared for every possibility that could happen. Never underestimate your opponent. Got it? Izuku nodded. "Now let's go, before the police and heroes arrive." They took off again, heading towards the barn. And after a couple of minutes, Izuku asked, "Will you teach me how to shoot with a gun? For fuck's sake, kid." Talking to teachers wasn't his forte, and never had been. So Izuku had been standing there in front of the teacher's lounge for 5 minutes now, playing with his fingers, hesitating. Talking in general wasn't his best skill. Communicating with others had never helped him, and often ended up hurting him. But he had to ask his teachers about his weapons. He wanted to know what he could get and what was too much for a first-year hero. Maybe he should have gone directly to the support department, where the pro hero power loader was in charge of the costumes. Yeah, he should go there, shouldn't he? But what if it was too early and no one was there? And what if he said no? That he couldn't personally customize his weapons? He should have done it earlier in the year while sending his costume demand. Why hadn't he done it then? Oh, that's right, because he had been stressing over starting UA, avoiding his mother, and trying to survive Kaizome's sparring lessons that had become 10 times harder since he had been accepted in the hero school. Problem child. Izuku started, looking up from his hands. Aizawa-sensei was in front of him, the teacher lounge's door open, and he was being stared at by red glowing eyes. Hi dash, he closed his mouth immediately. He was clearly annoying his teacher. Why had he thought it was a good idea? "Did you have a question?" Aizawa's bored voice cut through his thoughts again, and he grimaced. He was there now, right? Might as well ask. "I wanted to know if there's any regulations for weapons." "I kinda know about knives and blades. I have some preferences and I'd like to make them like I want to. So, what am I allowed to do?" Instead of the reaction Izuku thought he would have, rolled eyes and an annoyed sigh and a dismissed gesture, Aizawa actually hummed, brow furrowed. The teacher crossed his arms on his chest and leaned on the door frame. You'll have to check with Power Loader for that, but with your quirkless status, some things might change, since your weapons have nothing to do with a quirk. You actually know how to wield blades. It was so weird, not being judged for being quirkless, and actually having a conversation where he's treated as a human person. Izuku was still getting used to that. Yeah, I do. I've been training kinda on my own. With throwing knives, daggers, and a katana. Some other useful stuff. Clever of you. Well, you'll have to ask Power Loader, but I'm sure it'll be fine for you to just ask what you want. It's logical to want to use weapons you know how to use and are comfortable with. Did he just? Izuku blinked, surprised by the sudden compliment. He really hadn't been expecting that. And from Eraserhead. So cool. But for now, go back to class or you'll be late. Izuku nodded. And thank you. Izuku was about to leave, but then he paused. Just one more question? Aizawa looked at him, an eyebrow raised. I happen to already own some blades. Is it possible that I bring them here? For training. And to keep them with my hero costume? He would love to be able to keep them on himself all the time, but he was sure it wasn't allowed and probably illegal. Maybe after he got his hero provisional license. Theoretically, yes, you can bring them here. They'll just have to check them over to see if they're in the regulations. That was nice. And weird that his teacher wasn't demanding to know why he was asking that. Okay, thank you, sensei. And without another glance towards the man, Izuku darted off. Finally he'd be able to have good blades with him, even better, weapons he was used to. He'd have to bring them tomorrow. For the foundational skill of heroics we'll study today, rescue. It was decided you'll be supervised by me, All Might, and another person. Reactions were varied to that declaration, some disappointment and some rising interest. Izuku, for his part, was rather interested. That is what a hero should do first, save and help people, then capture the bad guys. Aizawa was letting them have the liberty of wearing their costume or not. Izuku chose to take it with him. As he reached for his case with his support weapons, he looked up at Aizawa, wanting to know if he was allowed to bring his blades. The teacher caught his glance and nodded slightly. Even if they were only going to do rescue, it felt right to have his blades with him. The uncomfortable feeling that he had since seeing the intruder yesterday hadn't left either, so he wanted to be prepared. As Kaizome taught him, being over-prepared is never a bad thing. Getting in the bus was a bit of a hassle, as Ida was overcomplicating things. Izuku ended up sitting next to Jairu, who had taken her seat next to him quietly. Izuku didn't really like taking the bus with the class. It wasn't anything personal towards his current class, but the memories of old bus travel with his old classmates were hovering and it made his skin crawl a little. But Jairu's calm presence helped a lot. He was actually zoning out when he heard someone call for him. He turned his head, focusing on the conversation. It was Azui, her tongue out, head tilted a bit and finger on chin. It took him a moment to process her question. Midoriya? We never saw your quirk, so I'm wondering what it is, Karo? Everyone was looking at him, waiting for his answer. Yeah, he really wasn't fond of bus rides. He actually didn't know what to answer. Tell the truth and the risk of losing their friendship? He couldn't survive another 3 years of bullying. He couldn't. But how could he lie about that? It was written in his record, and all he had was some basic sword skills. The silence stretched, only disturbed by the noise made by the bus motor. He wasn't ready to say that. He didn't want middle school to repeat itself. We're arriving soon, prepare to get off the bus. Aizawa's voice made them all startled, their teacher standing next to them, quirk activated, red eyes and floating hair. Izuku sighed. He was so thankful for the timing right now. Meeting number 13 made Izuku smile, knowing pretty much everything about the hero and their quirk, black hole, and seeing Uraraka fangirling made him chuckle. She reminded him of himself, before he was diagnosed as quirkless. As the teachers were explaining what they were going to do, describing the different areas of the USJ, places that imitate any kind of disaster, floods, incendies, earthquakes, etc., Izuku noticed something flickering in the corner of his eyes. He froze. Sensei? His voice was quiet, but Jairu stilled next to him, and Aizawa glanced at him. Izuku pointed to the plaza, all the way to the center of the huge training area. A sort of mist, dark purple, growing slowly, and someone walked out of it. Despite the alarming amount of severed hands on the person, Izuku recognized him. The guy that broke into UA the other day. His hands went on the tsuka of his katana, and he was so glad he had the entirety of his gear with him. The dark mist expanded, and more people villains got out of it. Huddle together and don't move. Aizawa told them, his capture weapon already moving. The students made noises of surprise, not really understanding what was going on. Jairu cursed next to him, having caught on. Izuku clenched his teeth but listened to Aizawa, backing off towards the exit and the rest of the class. Number 13, protect the students. What's going on? It was Kirishima who voiced the question. Don't move, those are real villains. And with that, Aizawa darted towards the plaza, where all the villains were. Izuku tightened his grip, restraining himself to go after him, because Aizawa was good, yes, but there were too many of them, he didn't have enough skill for that, few heroes did. Apparently he's been muttering, because Jairu interrupted his stream of words. You think we should go help him? Izuku grimaced, eyes darting around, counting villains, too many, counting exits. There was only one behind them. Aizawa told us to stay here. He glanced at Jairu, who was looking at him seriously. Your heartbeat is the steadiest here. I know you can fight, and you're thinking you can handle what's going on. You should go help him. That made him pause because yes, he was sort of calm, and he hadn't really thought about Jairu's ability to hear heartbeats. Then, the mist, a warp quirk Izuku's mind supplied, started talking. Eraserhead and number 13. According to the teacher curriculum we got the other day, All Might is also supposed to be here. Izuku cursed, he knew it. Where is he? We went through all this trouble. Don't tell me All Might, the number 1 hero, isn't here? That hasn't been the warper talking, but hand guy. Izuku frowned. They wanted All Might. But we, the League of Villain, want to destroy the symbol of peace. All Might needs to die. I wonder if he's going to show up if we kill the kids. Izuku didn't need another word of conviction from Jairu. He put on his mask that was hanging around his neck, hiding the down half of his face, and broke into a sprint, following Aizawa's path, focused on the villains. He noticed purple mist behind him, just missing him. He risked a glance back. He's warping the students. Shit, he's sending them on the incident sites. He couldn't think about that now. He had a teacher to help. Ahead of him, Aizawa was already fighting, hair and capture weapon floating. He was throwing punches left and right. And there were so many villains surrounding him already. Izuku clenched his teeth and took his katana out. Time to make good use of his mentor's training. He was about to reach the plaza when he got noticed, a few villains turning his way. A woman with serpents' hair, he had to avoid the snakes, maybe avoid the eyes if her quirk was related to Medusa, dodge her serpents, hit her in the guts, don't waste time, hit her with the flat of the blade on her arm, then knock her out with a right hook. Izuku took a breath. Next villain. Come on. He could do it. Even if his blade was out, he wasn't really using it yet, but soon enough, he understood. They wanted to kill him, he couldn't hesitate. He had to draw blood. He was debating if yes or no he should get closer to Aizawa, not knowing if he was going to bother the man more if he did. His hesitation cost him a hit in the thigh, ripping the cloth there. He whirled around, slashed with his blade, and he felt the katana cut through the villain's chest, blood immediately spilling out. The villain fell to the ground. Izuku swallowed. He knew the wound wasn't lethal, but still. So he straightened and went to work. Aizawa had noticed him and scolded, but didn't tell him to leave. So, side by side, blades and capture weapon took out villains, one by one. You can't hesitate. Start again. Izuku almost scolded, but stood up again, not bothering to dust off his pants from dirt. He'd been thrown down by Stain for the nth time today. Izuku had a sword, which was a little too long but very light, and Stain had no weapon. He knew it didn't mean he was armless. Of course, the body could also be a deadly weapon if used and trained well. But attacking someone with no obvious weapons or protections with a sword was new to Izuku. He was used to not being able to fight or protect himself, and now the roles were reversed. He was unsure about the situation. And yes, Stain was a really good fighter, and yes, Izuku had no chance of winning against him even with any kind of weapon. He'd been training with the man for little over a year now, and he was still shit at fighting. But still, he didn't want to hurt people even if said people were villains. That's not why he wanted to become a hero. And Izuku also knew that he would have no choice during taking down villains. They wouldn't hesitate to hurt him, so why should he? Kid. Izuku sighed, letting go of his fighting stance, focusing his glare on Stain. You can't hesitate. Because villains won't, and it will get you killed. Aikeno? I don't think you do know. To hesitate. If you have to draw blood, then so be it. You won't be able to save a lot of people if you can't even protect yourself, kid. Izuku clenched his jaw. He knew Stain was right, he knew it. He took a sharp breath, tightened his grip around the handle of his sword, and put himself back into his fighting stance. He'll try not to hesitate. Stain was right. One day he wouldn't have a choice. In the landslide zone, Todoroki was freezing the floor, encasting the villains in ice, and Hagakure was helping the best she could, while trying not to freeze to death. In the ruins zone, Bakugo was firing explosions after explosion, Kirishima by his side. In the mountains zone, Momo, Kaminari and Jairu were fighting off villains. Kaminari had already fried his brain. Momo was creating more and more weapons and devices. A worried Jairu kept her earjacks in the ground, sending sound waves towards the remaining villains, all the while praying that Midoriya and Aizawa-sensei were holding on. In the conflagration zone, Ojiro and Aoyama were running back towards the entrance, one swaying his tail, the other pushing off villains with his laser. In the downpour storm zone, Tokoyami and Kudo were fighting villains, Dark Shadow having a blast scaring the villains. In the flood zone, Azui was escaping a boat surrounded by villains thanks to her frog abilities, while annoyingly taking care of Mineta. She was wondering whether or not it was heroic to think about leaving him on the boat. In the entrance, number 13 was doing their best protecting the students, Ida, Uraraka, Shuji, Satu, Siro and Ishido bravingly helping them, but the pro-hero knew they wouldn't be able to hold on for much longer. Opening the door and sending Ida for backup were their main priorities, as was protecting the students. Izuku was starting to tire. His thighs, his mouth and his right arm were bleeding, most of his throwing knives were used, his katana bloody. He was breathing deeply, trying to continue to fight. He wasn't used to fighting so many at the same time, and trying to understand their quirks while fighting them and avoiding them was hard. And he wasn't used to the blades he was using, he was often missing his targets because the stupid weight in his throwing knives weren't balanced like he's used to, which was fucking annoying. As he glanced around, having just knocked out a villain with a sort of hedgehog quirk, he saw Aizawa fight against Hangai. His eyes widened. Hangai was counting, getting closer to his teacher, and Aizawa was slowing down, getting tired as well. Aizawa's hair fell down. Hangai smiled. Sensei. His quirk is disintegration, back off. Hangai froze for a second, permitting Aizawa to take a step back, then his hair went up again, he kicked the villain hard in the guts, making him groan. Before he could use his capture weapon on him, purple mist took Hangai away, leaving a panting Aizawa, but thankfully more or less uninjured. Izuku jogged to his teacher, noticing most of the villain that were on the plaza laid on the ground, or were gone. It was just him, Aizawa, Hangai, Mist Guy and the fountain, and the huge monster that was by their side. What the fuck was that? You're an annoying one, aren't you? Maybe you're different from the other NPCs, Hangai said, scratching his neck with his nails. But Izuku's eyes were still on the weird creature, trying to understand what it was. Animals with quirks were rare, and this didn't look like a normal animal. A sort of shape-shifting quirk maybe? But this thing didn't make any sense. This is a nomu, especially made to kill All Might. Izuku and Aizawa froze. It was made to kill All Might? He suddenly remembered that day on the roof, when All Might told him he couldn't be a hero. Something had been off with the hero, but Izuku hadn't been really focused on it. He had been not okay that day, and dissociating pretty much all along. Let's see if you really are better than those NPCs. Nomu, attack Eraserhead, I'll take care of the child. Shit, Not the time to remember random stuff. Before Izuku could do anything, Aizawa pushed him away with his capture weapon. Izuku shouted by surprise, seeing the nomu rushing towards his teacher with a scream. Izuku landed hard a few meters away, taking a few seconds to stand up again. He immediately turned towards his teacher, his heart stopping in his chest. The hero was currently in the grip of the nomu, eyes lit red, but it didn't seem to work. It's not a quirk then. Possibly a mutation, but those scars are medical scars. And he said it was made. Not the time to focus on that either. The nomu was holding Aizawa by the arms, and by the scream the teacher let out, he probably got his arm broken. Izuku was running back to him, blade in hand, but, "Don't come closer." Aizawa's warning stopped him. He couldn't just wait there. He glanced back at the hand's villain, who seemed to enjoy watching the scene. A spark of anger lit inside of Izuku, joining the ache, fear and tiredness that was already there. Izuku straightened as his opponent turned his red gaze towards him. Izuku clenched his hand. He had his katana, and one hunting knife left, that was all. Not much of his skin was showing, the many-layered armor was still going strong, with a few exceptions. He swallowed. "What's your name?" The villain tilted his head at his question, but answered, surprisingly. Izuku was just trying to buy some time to at least catch his breath. "Shigaraki Tamura." "What's yours?" Yeah, he wasn't going to answer that. At least not the truth. "Try to guess." Shigaraki frowned and then snarled. "That's not fair." Izuku almost rolled his eyes and under his breath said, "Yeah, no shit." At that, the villain charged him, right hand outstretched before him. Izuku put himself into his fighting stance, two hands around the tsuka of his katana. This time, he had to be fast and he couldn't afford to be touched. It was going to be like the battle trials, when he had kept avoiding Bakuga's explosions. Except the risk wasn't simple burns, it was disintegration. Izuku took a step back and swung his blade. After that, all was kind of a blur. He was trying his best to avoid Shigaraki's hands, and also tried his best at hitting the other hand coming towards his right side, twist his waist to avoid him, use his left hand to take his last knife and try cutting Shigaraki, anywhere, back off, try again, avoid, then hit, back off, almost trip, make the villain trip, hit him across the face with his katana. At that, Shigaraki cried out and took a few steps back, hands, his real ones, covering his face. Izuku hissed in and out a breath, which was coming out jagged out off his mask, transpiration dripping in his eyes, or maybe it was blood. So Izuku breathed, eyes driven on the villain, seeing the huge black blur the nomu was on the corner of his eyes. His whole body ached, although it wasn't worse than usual, but maybe it was the adrenaline helping. "What did you do?" Shigaraki was looking down at his hands which were covered in blood and on the left of his face was a red slash, his whole cheek cut open, blood leaking freely. Izuku expected to feel bad, or disgusted by his own action, but he wasn't. He felt satisfied. Shigaraki deserved it. He was targeting kids, for fuck's sake. He clenched his teeth and put himself back into his fighting stance. He was ready for round 2. But as he was going to advance, he stilled at someone's call. Shigaraki Tamura. It was the villain with the warp quirk that had spoken, who had just been a misty presence since then, was fully back, yellow eyes and metal collar. Shigaraki turned around, clearly annoyed. Izuku glanced at Aizawa. He was still immobilized by the nomu, but the creature seemed to have stopped moving, just holding him captive, awaiting further orders. "Thank God. You should go back up with the students." No. Aizawa's voice was so quiet that Izuku almost didn't hear his request. But he pressed his lips together and shook his head. He wasn't going to leave. He wouldn't leave Aizawa to fight alone against this nomu thing. Kurogyri. Is number 13 dead? Both Izuku and Aizawa focused back on the two villains at Shigaraki's question. "Please no. I have incapacitated them. However, I'm afraid a student escaped through the gates. That must have been Ida. Please let it be Ida for he was the fastest of them all." Shigaraki didn't seem to take the news well, throwing a sort of tantrum. "How old is he?" Talking with video games slang as well. "If you can't even do your job properly, then all of this is useless. All Might isn't here, more pro heroes will arrive. This is pissing me off. Izuku thought of something. It was taking a risk, but it couldn't get worse than this, right? He took a breath then said, "Actually, I saw you enter UA yesterday." Shigaraki turned slowly towards him, scratching his neck furiously. What? They knew something was up, so they changed the program last minute. All Might is on the other side of the country right now, and there's pro-heroes in the area, ready to intervene if something goes wrong. If Ida went out about now, in a few minutes, a bunch of heroes would arrive. The two villains were listening to him intently, and Izuku prayed for his voice to stay calm, to not stutter or hesitate. "Believe me, please. While it is possible that the young student here is lying, it would be best for us to retreat. It would be too much of a risk to continue this mission." Kurogiri seemed the most sensible of the pair, almost behaving like a parent toward the hand villain. "Why should I believe you? It's obvious that you don't trust me, but I have no reasons to lie. I hate All Might as much as any other guy." It was risky to admit this. He didn't hate All Might, but he strongly disliked him. Didn't mean he wanted him to die, thought. He was still the symbol of peace. Shigaraki tilted his head, stopping scratching his neck, which was red from the blood that was spilling out from his cheek wound. "You hate him? But you're a hero?" "Well, nobody's perfect. He said to my face that I couldn't be hero, so. Not a fan dash. Fresh." A loud noise resonated through the entire USJ, stopping everyone in their movements. "What did I say? I don't lie. The heroes are here." It was a total lie. Izuku had no idea where that sound came from or what it was. "Tamura, we have to go." Shigaraki cursed, then waved his hand, and as if it was the command Kurogiri was waiting for, slowly purple mist expanded, taking the closest villains with it. The nomu let go of Aizawa, and went back towards Shigaraki, both of them finally being engulfed by the mist. But Shigaraki had the time to say a last comment, voice full of anger. "We'll meet again, you're pissing me off. I'll cut your face next time." And then they disappeared, leaving nothing behind, only bloodstains. Everything stayed still for a while, the silence deafening. Then there was another loud crash and, "Have no fear, for I am here." Izuku almost laughed, if not for being concentrated on running back to his teacher, who was laying on the ground. But he was moving and breathing, to Izuku's relief. He let go of his katana, the blade was bloody, and undid his mask, letting it rest back around his neck. He helped his teacher sit up, careful around his arm, that was leaking blood, but not an alarming amount, and no bones were visible. Izuku sat down as well, exhaustion finally slipping in. His entire body ached. Almost worse than the aftermath of Kaizome's lessons. "You're all right, sensei?" His teacher was staring at him with almost disbelief, then he shook his head. "You really are a problem child." Izuku smiled sheepishly, wiping the blood from his blade on his pants. His heart was slowing down. The villains were gone. He took a deep breath. "You acted recklessly." Izuku lifted his head, green eyes meeting black dry ones. "But you probably saved a lot of people today. So thank you." It was Izuku's turn to stare in disbelief at Aizawa. Then he smiled, bright and toothy. Aizawa scolded, but his eyes were soft, and Izuku almost let out a giggle. Well, he did let out a giggle, but no one had to know about it. Only him. And Aizawa. "Also, you should tie your hair, since it's a giveaway if you use your quirk or not. Stop talking, problem child." The first loud crash had actually been Jiro and Kaminari, who had tried to access the command room to try and communicate to the outside, but the whole thing had exploded because of a villain trying to stop them from entering, and an overload of electricity caused accidentally by Kaminari. The second loud crash had obviously been All Might arriving, to a villain's empty place. Izuku and Aizawa walked back at the entrance. Almost all the students were there. The gates were opened and pro-heroes were actually arriving with the police and ambulances. The first and only person sent to the hospital urgently had been number 13, but the medics had said they would be fine. Jiro went immediately to Izuku, and he was so relieved to see her with only a few scratches. The pro-hero, Recovery Girl, had arrived as well, distributing kisses left and right, some students needing it more than others. Izuku received one as well, feeling more exhaustion creeping in, but he didn't pass out. He had been pleasantly surprised to see that none of him had been disintegrated. Aizawa had been treated first, enjoying his newly healed arm and talking to the policeman, to a certain detective Tsukachi. In the end there hadn't been any irreversible damages, which was good, but also weird. Those were professional villains, but their plan had seemed so simple, almost too much. There had been so many things that could have gone wrong, and it did. The main thing being All Might's absence. Were they really going to kill all the students? Then what? Their only advantage had been this nomu thing, which yes, this was worrying. Shigaraki had been the mastermind there, but his plan hadn't been solid at all. There was also the fact that he had sacrificed at least 50 villains for this. But Izuku was glad about all that. They had been lucky, he knew this. Next time, because he knew there was going to be a next time, they wouldn't be so lucky. But he would be ready. After some questions, they let the students go rather quickly. Aizawa had seemed hesitant to do so, but Principal Nedzu and some of the authorities had been sure about their safety. A lot of the class had been picked up by their parents. Izuku waited with Jairu, talking quietly with her. She went home, with a promise from him to text later. Seeing that no one was paying attention to him, he left UA. He didn't know if he wanted to go home. He also didn't know what was worse, his mother being absent or present. He didn't want to explain to her what happened. She might not even want to hear about it. He wanted to see Kaizome. He'll go to the barn and wait there for him. It also wouldn't be the first time he slept the night there. As he walked, he felt the aches of his muscles, the tiredness behind his eyes, how heavier his school bag felt, but he still was super aware of what was going on around him, as if the adrenaline hadn't completely faded away. He really wanted to sleep. But he stayed aware of his surroundings, Shigaraki's last threat still fresh in his memory. He blinked, already in front of his apartment door, took the key from his pocket, and went in. The inside was still and silent. Of course, not out of the ordinary, but something made him pause. He closed the door behind him, glancing around while he took off his red shoes. He didn't light the apartment, the setting sun outside shining through the windows, making everything seem gold. He walked to the kitchen and stopped short when he saw a piece of paper on the table, next to a thick envelope. Slowly, he approached it, cautious, as if it was going to jump on him. It was just a piece of paper, so why was his heartbeat increasing so fast? With a slightly trembling hand, he took the letter, feeling his stomach drop as he recognized the handwriting. It was his mother's. He blinked a few times, then started reading the few kanjis written on the paper. I can't watch you die. Because you know that's what is going to happen if you go down that path. I don't understand why you keep thinking you can do it. It's not good for you. All I wanted was for you to do something not as reckless as trying to be a hero. You need to grow up and realize that life isn't like that. You need to stop following this child's dream you have. I can't watch you destroy yourself like this. I don't recognize you anymore. I don't think you understand how hard it is for me. There's money in the envelope, and I think your scholarship helps you enough so you can rent a studio. Izuku stared at the paper for a second more, then reread it, slowly. He put the letter back down on the table. It was straight to the point. There were no emotions, no goodbyes, nothing. Not even a signature. Izuku swallowed. His eyes were starting to burn, but no. He wouldn't cry, not over that. Not over her. He wouldn't. A tear fell down his cheek, slowly, rolling to his chin, staying there for a while, then falling on the kitchen floor. He wasn't even surprised. He was kinda waiting for that actually. He had thought about leaving the house before, but he was still too young to get a job and to live alone. And despite everything, he didn't want to leave his mom alone. His dad had already left, probably because of him, so he hadn't wanted to. But here he was. He had thought that maybe, after proving her that he could be a hero, she would start accepting him. She would start loving him again. He swallowed, his brows furrowed. I don't think you understand how hard it is for me. Hard for her? What about him? What about the years of bullying, neglect, and discrimination? What about the suicide baiting, about being treated like glass, or worse, like he wasn't even human and just trash? What about being ignored, laughed at, pitted at? What about that? He clenched his jaw. He refused to feel angry. Not at her. It wasn't her fault. Who would want a quirkless child? She had done a lot for him already. He wiped his tears away, took the envelope, the letter, and went to his room. Half an hour later, he got out, 2 heavy bags and his school bag with him. He closed the door of the apartment with his keys, then hid them under the rug that was at the entrance. He walked out of the building complex, fast, steady steps, steady breath. His eyes were dry. When Kaizome got back to the barn, Izuku had already been there for a couple hours, his stuff on the sofa, and him laying on the floor staring at the ceiling. He felt weirdly empty. He had expected to cry, or feel sad or angry. But he was feeling absolutely nothing. The only person that should have loved him didn't. So he stayed there staring at the wooden ceiling. A shadow over his face made Izuku blink. "You alive, kid?" And yeah, maybe it was the fact that he now knew his mother didn't love him, or that finally all that happened today crashed on him on this moment, or maybe it was the familiar rough voice of Kaizome, but Izuku's mouth quivered, and then tears started to fall. Hot tears, streaming down the sides of his face on his temples. It took a while for him to calm down, and Kaizome had no idea what to do to help him, so they had both sat down on the sofa. Kaizome was sharpening his katana, talking in a low voice about his day, and Izuku was listening to him, curled up on one corner of the couch. It was while he was still feeling horrible, rather nice. After a moment of silence, the only noise filling the room being the tool sharpener against the blade, Kaizome spoke out loud. "Been a while since I've seen you in that state. What happened?" It took a moment for Izuku to remember how to talk, his mind being all fuzzy, and he wondered if maybe he had been dissociating since leaving his mom's apartment. Like Kaizome said, it hasn't happened in a while. He swallowed. Then he opened his mouth, and words started flowing out. He told the man everything that happened. The USJ, the League of Villains, the nomu, and then his mother kicking him out. Kaizome hadn't interrupted him during his explanations, but his jaw had tightened, as his grip did around his blade. The man wasn't the one to show his emotions easily, and it was only because Izuku knew him for 5 years that he could read him well. The man was angry. He hoped that he wasn't mad at him, otherwise he would probably start crying again, or do something very stupid. The League of Villains, huh? Kaizome's voice startled him out of his thoughts, and he nodded. The hero killer took a deep breath, and turned to meet his eyes. Izuku stayed still, eyes wide and still a little teary, hands around his knees, keeping his legs close to his chest. "I should have told you about that before. It's important information, even more if you're in touch with what's going on the illegal side of business." Izuku frowned. Kaizome usually didn't withdraw any kind of information, answering questions he knew the answer of, and most of the time, when he didn't answer, it was because it was something personal, or he simply didn't know. Izuku actually knew a good chunk of what was happening between villains, their gang, their contacts, and quirks. Information that a first year at UA definitely shouldn't know. And now, with what Kaizome just said, his curiosity was piqued. There's rumors going around in the underground. Legends about villains and dark times, before, at the beginning of the appearance of quirks. Kaizome sighed, clearly wondering how the hell he was going to explain all that. But he glanced at the kid, who was looking truly alive since he arrived at the barn. "Alright, time to tell a story. We don't know much, and it's more of a rumor than anything, like I said. But as you know too, rumors are rather taken seriously in the underground. There was a man, a villain, that used to rule, and had a strong quirk. A quirk that could take quirks." Izuku stilled at that. This was never heard of. He blinked. "Wait until I've finished talking before shooting a billion questions, kid." So this man kind of disappeared for a while. And I'm talking decades here. But people started talking about him again in the last few years, about his return. Which would make him really fucking old, so he might have gained a sort of immortality quirk along the way. Anyway, that League of Villains? Most definitely working for him. If that's truly him, and not some idiot imitating him. Shigaraki, right? Disintegration quirk? Powerful fucker, but he's a fucking kid. Don't underestimate them, though. I won't. He told me he would meet me again. To give back what I did to him. Kaizome grimaced at that, looking honestly annoyed. "Be careful then." "I will." A moment of silence. "Do you know anything about nomu?" Kaizome shook his head, starting to sharpen his blade again. Izuku watched him do it, waiting for something he didn't really know what though. You can't stay here. Izuku's heart dropped. He kept his eyes driven on his knees. He had thought that maybe, but yeah, of course. What was Izuku thinking? Why would a villain let him stay in his hiding place? Like he wanted him here in the first place? It's not in good enough shape to live in. You'll be too cold at night and there's no electricity. You got a place in mind already? Izuku looked up at Kaizome, who frowned. Are you going to cry again? I told you I don't like crying kids. Izuku actually snorted. He had heard this sentence so many times, less and less through the years as he learned to keep his emotions in check. He hadn't expected Kaizome to worry about his living situation. In his chest, a little warmth crept in, chasing the cold away. The whole day after the USJ and Izuku's breakdown at the barn, they had looked for a studio in the area. Close enough to the barn, but not too much, and not too far from the train station he used to go to catch the train to UA. But he also hadn't wanted to stay too close to his old apartment, not wanting to run into some neighbors, or his mother. They found one, in some very old building complex. It was cheap and it showed, but it wasn't inhabitable, just very old. The studio was a one-room thing, enough space for a futon, a small table and a chair, a tiny kitchen and surprisingly, a bathroom. It was so small, but Izuku couldn't complain. It was the best he could afford, and the best he would get. One of the useful things about the apartment was the fire escape just outside its only window. 2 exits were always better than 1. After that, Izuku spent the rest of the day at the barn, sparring with Kaizome. He had missed doing it and he could tell the man had as well. It had become their almost nightly ritual, and it was fun now. I have to show you something. Kaizome had interrupted Izuku while he was doing his stretching, and he looked up curiously. The villain was taking a long bag out of the hidden closet, joining Izuku on the tatami, legs crossed. After what happened at the USJ, and Shigaraki's threat, I want you to have those on you all the time. Kaizome hadn't moved, so Izuku glanced at the bag, then back at the man. He arched an eyebrow, but Kaizome's face revealed nothing. Slowly he opened the bag. He had a vague idea of what might be in it, but when he opened it, his eyes widened. He had been right, but there were so many knives. You gotta relax first. You can't throw a knife with your body so tense up. Relax. I'm trying. Stand up straight. Right foot forward, left foot slightly behind it. Izuku put himself into the position Stain was describing. Alright, take that knife. We'll start with throwing it in a half spin first. Then we'll do a full spin when you get that. Okay? Okay. It had taken a full day of throwing knives, again and again and again, until Izuku's right arm and hand were hurting. But in the end he was hitting the target more and more on the wall with the pointy end of the knives, so it was worth it. Now try with your left hand. So he had lost his mother, but he had gained a nice set of knives. He'd call that a win. He hadn't been able to utter a word since he had opened the bag. He was used at 1, not receiving gifts, and 2nd at using Kaizome's old weapons, or buying his own with the money he owned by doing small jobs here and there. But seeing it there, all shiny and new and matching, black, silver, green, made him so happy. Kaizome had given him a gift. Something so valuable. Because it was so much more than just blades. It was a promise. It was, I want you to be safe, and I believe in you, and you're skilled enough for good professional blades. It was all that and more. Izuku swallowed and looked up to his mentor. The man was watching him, sitting cross-legged on the tatami, seemingly relaxed. He wanted to say thank you. He also wanted to laugh and maybe cry. He also wanted to hug Kaizome. But all he did was croak out a thank you, and all Kaizome did was nod his head in response. The next day, Izuku arrived early at UA with a case full of new knives. He was kinda nervous about having so many weapons on him, because it would be really awkward if he was asked to show what was in the case. The night before, he and Kaizome had spent hours trying his new gear. The man clearly was good at picking it, because each blade had been perfect and exactly how Izuku liked and was used to. He just really hoped that no one was going to question him on where he got it and who bought it or anything like it. because he couldn't really answer by, "Oh, you know, my mentor who's the hero killer bought it because he's been training me for years hoping I'd become a hero." No, he couldn't really answer with that, could he? He could always lie, which he'd been doing for a while now and was good at it. But lying in front of professional heroes was another thing than lying to your mother about where you were last night. A pang of sadness made him frown at the thought of his mother. He clearly wasn't over it, and it still really fucking hurt. He tried for so long to be seen by her, and to be accepted, to be understood by her, to be loved. He tried so hard. And all she did was write him a letter about how hurt she was and how hard it was for her. His grip tightened around the handle of his case, and without really noticing he had started to walk faster, and his breathing had picked up. He hadn't really lost anything, he thought. He never really had her, in the end. He had all he needed, right now anyway. He had a good set of knives, he was in his dream school, and he had a supportive mentor. He couldn't ask for more. He blinked and willed his dark thoughts away. He hadn't had a breakdown like that since that day on the roof, just after being left there by All Might. So it had kinda not been a surprise to just break down in front of Kaizome. And now that his heart and head were a little more clear, he felt lighter in some way. In front of him, the yellow letter of UA on the front gate glimmered thanks to the rising sun. Yes, he had lost his M. He had lost Inko. But now, no more lying, no more empty apartments and empty promises, no more neglectful acts and useless conversations. He was at UA, and he was training to be a hero. It was going to be okay. Hopefully. Finding Power Loader's class was easy, because all you had to do was to follow the noise of explosions and yelled warnings. It made Izuku smile a little as he hesitated in front of the big doors, hand tight around his case. He took advantage of a moment of silence to knock and slightly open the door, entering head first, looking around. The whole class, well, it was more a lab, was a mess. There were pieces of metals, of robots and blueprints, plenty of tools and gear, everywhere. His fingers itched to search everything, to build his gear, like he used to do at the barn, except here he would have good materials and the right tools. A laugh and an explosion made him start a little, his eyes going to the far end corner, a person with pink dreadlocks looking like they were having the time of their life, while the desk was quite literally on fire. Izuku arched an eyebrow, impressed. Looking for something? At that, Izuku didn't start, because he had seen a shadow at the corner of his eye, so he just turned around, Power Loader standing there, red hair and huge yellow helmet. I talked to Aizawa-sensei before and he said I'd have to ask you, but, yeah. So I have this set of knives and other blade stuff. And I wondered if I could have it with my hero gear? And I don't know if I can. I couldn't really find any regulations on bringing my own weapons, so... Hey, breathe a little, lad. Izuku took a breath, now aware that he had been talking fast and without breaks. He was still nervous to talk to any teachers, and to pro-heroes. He grimaced. Aizawa-san told me about you. I do need to check if they're in the regulations. You got it on you? Yeah, great. Give them to me, I'll see what I can do. I'll tell you later, alright? Izuku nodded, giving the case to the hero, hoping his hesitation wasn't too obvious. It was a gift and he didn't want to just give it away like that. And what if it wasn't okay for him to have those blades? Were they going to throw them away? He hoped not. It's fine, lad. Stop worrying, I'm just going to check them, to see if they're not poor quality. Wouldn't you want your knives to break before even having a serious fight, would you? No, sir. And with that, Izuku exited the lab, one last glance at his case and at the pink-haired student having a blast in the other corner. He bowed quickly to Power Loader and walked out of the lab. Going back to class after the incident in the USJ was kinda weird. Like they had to act all normal after being attacked by real villains and facing the most dangerous situation they ever had. Well, that was the case for the rest of Class 1A, and Izuku knew what it felt like. He was just used to danger, now. But still it was weird. Everyone was chatting rather excitedly, Uraraka trying to have a conversation with him, but Izuku wasn't really in the mood to confront her bubbly personality. So he just waved at her and went to sit at his table, eyes catching Jairu's. She smiled at him and he nodded back. They had texted a bit during their break, but Izuku had been pretty occupied. She didn't seem to mind apparently, which was a relief. He sat at his place, Bakugo already at his, oddly silent and ignoring him. Izuku wasn't going to complain. The class door opened, revealing Aizawa. Morning. Morning, sensei. He went to his desk and continued. I hope you took yesterday as a rest day, 'cause you won't have one any day soon. The whole class froze, worried. That kinda sounded like a threat. UA Sports Festival is coming soon. Izuku blinked. He totally had forgotten about it, and by the excited and surprised shouts and reactions from his classmates, he wasn't the only one. He used to religiously watch the sport festival each year when growing up, but he kinda stopped after he met Kaizomi. He still watched it, of course, but most of the time he only found some free time to do so after the event, because Kaizomi didn't care for it and it wasn't an excuse to miss training. It was just a stupid show to display power and earn money, which he wasn't wrong. After calming down the class, Aizawa began to explain that the event would still happen even with the recent attacks, but that the security will be increased and the school was confident in their protection. It would be a little foolish to attack it anyway, Izuku thought. The villains had taken rather heavy losses compared to the heroes anyway. So attacking when in a weakened state a stad full of hero students and pro-heroes seemed like a suicide mission. Anyway, remember the goal of this festival. For you, you'll want to get noticed by some pros, to get an internship and hopefully a start to a career or at the very least some experience. Like I said, you won't get any rest until then, you gotta give it your best. After passing the whole homeroom talking about it, questioning and getting answers, the bell rang, indicating it was lunchtime. Hey, why's the exit blocked? Izuku turned towards the door, and yup, it was indeed blocked by a load of students, all muttering and looking into the class with curiosity. What a bunch of idiots! That had been Jairu, saying it under her breath, standing next to him. He titled his head down to her, making her understand he had heard her but keeping his eyes on the students. They want to see the students who fought real villains, like we're animals in a zoo. Izuku frowned. Did they really think it had been fun to fight villains? He sighed and rolled his eyes. He noticed that a lot of hero students didn't yet understand what it meant to be on the field. Like it was just a game, just showing off pretty quirks and being a cool hero. Get out of the way, extras. Then people started to argue and shout. No. They found better get out before he explodes everything. Izuku had also talked under his breath, only Jairu hearing him, and she snickered. I came to see what you kids are made of, but I didn't think you were this arrogant. Both Izuku and Jairu were closer to the crowd and watched as a student, blonde hair and blue eyes with a lazy smirk, advanced and talked. Everyone thinks that 1A is the best, but from what I see you're definitely not. Class 1B is so superior in many ways. Silence reigned, while the guy talked, his eyes driven on Bakugo, who was still scolding, hands in his pockets but seeming ready to explode the guy's head. But Izuku soon tuned him out, because there was clearly just jealousy and stupidity in the student's statement. It wasn't worth listening to. So this is a declaration of war. Us, Class 1B, will be coming after you. I'll try to pull out the rug from under your feet, while you're all on your high horses. Then, another kid added something, and Bakugo started to yell back. At least he was clear, Izuku whispered to Jairu, who nodded, eyebrows raised. After that, the crowd diminished, people going to eat, seeing that most of the drama had happened. As Yusuke was going to go eat outside, Jir followed him. He was stopped by someone. Problem child. Izuku turned around. Yes, sensei? Oh god, did he do something wrong? He hadn't partake in the weird interaction with the other classes earlier. Need to talk to you. It's about your hero gear. His knives. Right. He kinda had forgotten about it, to be honest, with the sport festival announcement and all that. Oh right. I'll see you later, Jairu. She nodded with a small smile and walked away. Come on, let's go to my office. You'll have time to eat after, don't worry. After a short walk to Aizawa's office, which Izuku found awkward, but maybe it was just his social anxiety manifesting. They went into the teacher lounge and then to Aizawa's office, which was separated from the lounge. The room was simple and bare, a desk with a computer and piles of files and papers, a wall covered with a bookcase. They sat Izuku into the surprisingly comfortable chair in front of Aizawa's desk, and his teacher sat in his own chair. So, Izuku's case was on the desk, open, revealing the whole set of knives. First of all, those are of really good quality, made in an almost unbreakable metal, and they'll hardly ever need maintenance. But I think you knew that, right? Izuku nodded, heart beating faster. Those are professional blades and seemed new. Can I ask where you got them? For a brief moment, Izuku panicked. But then again he was expecting this question. So he took a breath, his hands gripping his tights. I don't really know, actually. They are a gift. From my mother. She promised to get me some real blades if I entered UA. Well, she knows her stuff. Izuku smiled a little. It had been a complete lie, of course. But if you replace Inko with Kaizome, it wasn't a lie anymore. Another question. Oh no. Do you really know how to fight with those? I've seen a little of your capacities at the USJ, but I was also concentrating on my own fights. Izuku blinked, not having expected this question, although it was obvious to ask him that. Oh, yes? Aizawa arched an eyebrow. Why did that sound more like a question than anything else? Izuku didn't mean to sound like that. He grimaced, looking at the wall behind his teacher. It felt like an interrogation and he didn't like it. Also, in the past, being alone with a teacher never ended well for him. He just wanted his knives back. Alright, this is what we're going to do. Izuku's eyes snapped back to Aizawa's. After your classes, we'll meet at the gym and I'll evaluate your skills. Depending on your results, I'll decide what we do from there. All right with you? He didn't really have a choice anyway, did he? Izuku nodded. He could do that. It would be like a sparring session with Kaizome, or an exercise in heroics. One last thing. Izuku swallowed. Was this never going to end? He watched Aizawa take one of his weapons from his case and he forgot it was there. Is that a butterfly knife? It was said in such an unimpressed voice and with a raised eyebrow that Izuku grimaced. Yes? There was a moment of silence, then his teacher signed, bringing a hand to his forehead. Without another word he put back the knife. Now go eat. I'll keep those with me for now, yes? Yes, sir. Izuku got out of the teacher's lounge without hesitation, wanting to walk very far away. It hadn't been awkward or anything, but he was always expecting to get scolded, or accused of cheating, or being told he was not doing enough. He was so used to being told those things by his past teachers. He hadn't seemed to be that bothered by the butterfly knife, which was supposed to be illegal to own. Kaizome knew that but still had put it in the case, and Izuku hadn't even thought about it, and here he was. He was sure the man did it on purpose, it was the kind of joke he made. But anyway, Aizawa had just asked some questions and that's it. It was nice. The rest of the day passed rather quickly and without any disturbances. Izuku had joined Jairu for lunch, where she asked him what Aizawa had wanted to talk about, which led to Izuku rambling for a good while about his knives and his katana and all the blades he liked to use. And then, at the end of the day, Izuku had gone to the gym his teacher had asked him to meet at, feeling a little nervous but also excited to use his new blades. So, I want you to throw those knives into those targets and we'll go from there. Shoyuta wasn't expecting this. He had already been impressed by the kid's abilities, having seen them at the USJ and having watched his performance at the entrance exam. He had been even more impressed when he learned the boy was quirkless. But this was insane. After watching Midoriya throwing knives, using 2 long kunai on some dummies and finally fighting with his katana against Shoyuta, while he himself only had his capture weapon. It had been more than impressive. The kid was probably as good as a professional. Within a couple years and lot more experience he would be as good as one, and he wasn't thinking those words lightly. He was also fighting dirty, using everything to his advantage, bright green eyes glancing around, always thinking, always being one step ahead. Also, Midoriya's nervousness seemed to completely disappear when fighting, a more mature and self-assured Midoriya taking place. After what seemed like hours of sparring, Shoyuta finally put an end to it. Even more surprising, the kid wasn't even sweating or breathing hard. It was almost as if he had just started. But at his words, he stopped, putting down his blade. Alright, good job, kid. Midoriya started, not having expected the words, surely. His eyes widened a little, and the ghost of a smile appeared on his freckled face. Shoyuta sat down on the training mat, feeling a little drained, not having recuperated entirely from the USJ. He was getting old, sue him. The problem child sat down as well, crossing his legs and laying his katana on his tights, hands lightly put on the blade. The way the kid handled weapons was something Shoyuta almost never saw anymore, with care and reverence. When'd you start training? Midoriya's eyes narrowed and hesitated. He did that every time he was asked a question, thinking hard and answering with careful words. As if answering was a life or death situation, which was worrying. There were also other things in his comportment that made Shoyuta worry, but he'd had to wait a little to really see. Maybe the kid only had anxiety and nothing more. About 5 years ago. I pretty much trained every day since. Shuta's eyebrows shot up. For 5 years? Since he was about 10? That explained it a little. Did you have a teacher? At that Midoriya stilled, his eyes snapping back to Shuta's, eyes searching for something. He let the kid take his time to answer. He apparently had some issues with trust, and it was alright, so Shoyuta didn't push. An old person that used to be a good fighter with blades. I don't really know what they used to do, but I was kinda desperate at this point, so I accepted their help. And they gave free lessons, so I also learned from tutos on YouTube though. And watching heroes fights. Shoyuta nodded slowly. There was a lot to unpack here. He had been desperate? Enough to accept the help of a complete stranger. And the kid was protecting their identity for sure. Shoyuta decided not to push his luck, already glad his student answered something that looked like some truth. But you have permission to keep those blades in your hero costume, as your hero gear. You're more than good with your knives. Midoriya seemed to light up at that, but then hesitated, looking like he wanted to ask something but didn't dare. You have a question? Two, actually. Shoyuta made a gesture with his hand, encouraging him to ask. Could I? Is it possible to keep some knives on me all the time? At the USJ, Shigaraki told me he, wanted to hurt me back, and I don't feel safe without my blades just walking around. Others have their quirks, but So, I promise it would only be for self-defense. Problem child. Breathe. What the kid was asking for honestly made sense and was logical. And from what he had seen and what he knew about Midoriya's personality, he was sure he was telling the truth, and those concerns were founded. I'll probably need to talk to Nedzu at the very least, but yes, you can. Just show me what you'll keep on you. If someone bothers you with it, just tell them I gave you permission. But if you use it for anything else, I'll give you hell, understand? Midoriya nodded fast, lips in a straight line, looking serious. He then chose to keep a couple of small throwing daggers and 2 daikunai. You had another question? His student started, seemingly having forgotten that he indeed had 2 questions to ask. I know that for the sports festival, someone has to give a speech at the start, someone that represents the first year. And I'm pretty sure it would be me? I got the best score on both the written and practical exam, right? Shoyuta nodded, crossing his arms, slowly understanding where this was going. I would prefer not to do it. I don't want to be exposed. I don't want or need the attention. I want to go underground, and I don't want to become a target for villains, 'cause I'm pretty sure they all watch the sport festival, since, it shows all the quirks of the soon-to-become heroes, and I don't want to be outed as Quirkless. There was a moment of silence, where Midoriya caught his breath and Shoyuta wondered how in the world could the problem child talk so fast. But I would understand if you don't want to. I mean, I already bothered you so much, and I don't want to be a burden anymore, and dash. Kid. Midoriya stopped talking and moving, looking at him with wide green eyes. You're not bothering me. You're not a burden. I'm your teacher and you're my student. I'm literally doing my job. Being a hero is helping others, is it not? The kid seemed to relax a bit at that. And your request is totally understandable and logical. I'll talk to Nedzu, but it should be dealt with. I'll let you know if not. Thanks, sensei. And the kid bowed very low. Shoyuta was surprised to not see him fall, although he had shown very good stability and balance throughout the sparring lesson. If it even had been a lesson. Then, Shoyuta dismissed his student. He had to talk to Nedzu. While he was pleasantly surprised by the talent he'd seen in Midoriya, it was also kinda worrying, so he'd have to check that out. At the back of his mind, something was just there. Midoriya's fighting style had sort of been familiar, but he couldn't put his finger on it. And the kid had said he watched Hiro's fights. Maybe he'd been inspired by it. It probably wasn't important, anyway. Also, the kid wanted to go underground? He hadn't taken any internship for a while now. Maybe he'd rethink that?